Very busy on the policing front recently. Yesterday, the Police and Crime Committee held a question and answer session with the Victims Commissioner, who is tasked with improving the experience of victims and survivors of crime in London, ensuring that victims are getting the support that they need. We're very grateful for Claire Waxman's time. Last month, we also discussed the resourcing arrangements for the Mayor's Violent Crime Task Force with the Met and MOPAC. As part of its investigation into violence in the capital, the Police and Crime Committee held a debate in the Chamber with a range of organisations and individuals about the impact of violence and possible solutions to prevent it. The committee will shortly be responding to the Mayor on his approach to tackling violence and ensure that the views of Londoners can help shape his response. Declarations of interest. Can I ask the Assembly to note the recommendation set out at item 2? Thank you very much. Do members have any other declarations to make which are relevant to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Okay, thank you very much. We now move to today's main item of business, a question and answer session with the Mayor and with Cressida, the Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis, on policing in London. Welcome to the meeting. It's written down here, it says, welcome to the meeting. There are 4 lead-off questions, and Assembly members may ask supplementary questions after each question has been answered. Before asking the lead-off questions, the Assembly will receive a short opening statement from the Mayor and from the Commissioner of up to 5 minutes in total. Would you like to start, Mr. Mayor?
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here with the Commissioner to talk about policing, crime and safety in our great city. I want to take this opportunity to thank once again the brave men and women who serve in our police service. The last few years have been extremely difficult for London, with a number of terrorist attacks and the awful Grenfell Tower fire. But amid these tragedies, I know the heroism and dedication of our police force has been and continues to be a huge source of pride and inspiration to us all. As Mayor, my top priority is the safety of Londoners. And I want to say at the outset that I continue to have grave concerns about how the Met and actually police forces across our country are being overly stretched. In London, our population has been growing, placing ever greater demands on our police, where numbers have been going down. Due to cuts from central government to the Met Police budget, the Met has already been forced to make over £700 million worth of savings since 2010, resulting in police officer numbers falling to the lowest level in 20 years. Recorded crime is rising, both in London and across the country, and the threat from terrorism is at an unprecedented level. Yet at the same time, the government is insisting that the Met must find further cuts. This is unquestionably putting the safety of Londoners at risk. The government's budget early this week was billed as the end of austerity, but that's clearly not the case. Despite unprecedented warnings about public safety from the cross-party Home Affairs Select Committee and from senior police officers, the calls for more police funding have been ignored by the government. There can be no doubt that there is a link between the cuts to policing by this government and the increase in violent crime. That's the view of Home Office officials, the Home Affairs Select Committee and police officers. The truth is that cuts really do have consequences. That's why I'll continue to call on the Prime Minister to step up and make sure our police have the funding they need to keep our city safe. I was also extremely disappointed to see that there was zero investment in this week's budget for youth services to create more opportunities for young people. This is incredibly short-sighted. The causes of violent crime are extremely complex, involving criminal gangs, drugs, poverty and a lack of opportunities. The solution will always require action to tackle the root causes of crime as well as crime itself. City Hall is working closely with the Met Police Service to tackle this problem head-on, not only by supporting the Met's Violent Crime Task Force, but by creating a new Violence Reduction Unit to tackle the causes of crime through a public health approach. I look forward to answering questions during the course of this morning.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, have you anything to say?
Thank you. Very briefly, Chair. Thank you again for inviting me here today. When I was with you at the end of last year, we were, of course, reflecting on the unsurpassed horrors of 2017, the terrorism, as the Mayor has mentioned, and Grenfell Tower, casting a shadow over our city. Today, almost a year on, We are, of course, all of us, still learning some lessons from those terrible events, but we've also witnessed the resilience of London and indeed of its police services. The capital and its citizens carry on. Visitors from all over the world are still coming to see our great city, and my people, my officers and staff, continue to keep them as safe as we possibly can. You know, this year has not been without its challenges. We have seen increasing demand across the Met in terms of volumes, in terms of complexity, and in some respects in terms of expectations. We are looking towards decreased resources in the future in real terms at the moment. You all know, I think, that I announced when I arrived as Commissioner that violent crime was my priority, and bearing down on it in all its forms was my priority. I have no intention of allowing the horrible levels of violence that we saw at the beginning of this calendar year to become anything like the new normality in London. Most serious violence is no longer increasing as it was for the previous 3 years. It's plateaued and indeed in many categories is beginning to decrease. I am not remotely complacent about that, and just yesterday, of course, we had another tragic homicide in Southwark, and each one is ghastly. But I do thank the Met, the people of the Met, for their enormous efforts, and indeed all of you and other people involved in supporting us directly and indirectly through partnerships. We won't be able to solve the issues of violence alone. We depend on the people, the public who help us, and the local partners that we work with. Like terrorism, bearing down on violence, it requires a whole system approach, and we remain very committed to our local police services. However, the job of a commissioner is not just to look at the operational priorities, as it were, of today and in the medium term, but to look forward. We've done in relation to mobile-enabled crime, which, as you know, is going up almost exponentially for 2 or 3 years, now hugely down. I'm very proud of the efforts against violent crime. The whole Met has pivoted, and it is, on everybody's agenda. A huge number of people have contributed to that, not least, of course, the Violent Crime Task Force. But when you look at the productivity, the arrests, the seizures across the whole Met, it is an enormous set of successes in terms of our investigations and our seizures. Again, much more to do. I'm very pleased with the work of our public order people. You may not think of that as crime, but my goodness, we're working in quite unsettled times, international uncertainties, political uncertainties, some tensions in some of our communities, and we have prevented major disorder or indeed significant disorder, despite having some enormous protests and events to deal with. Our criminal finance seizures are up at record levels. We've influenced government policy in a number of ways, and we're a huge user, as an example, of the account freezing orders, way ahead of any other law enforcement body. We've done some great work in modern slavery and human trafficking. Just last week, you'll have seen the arrests in relation to a joint investigation with Romania. And I think we are showing some strong leadership in support of the National Police Chiefs Council, working with government, working with the Mayor in so many areas, not least, of course, county lines, gangs and serious violence. But it has been a very challenging year. As the Mayor mentioned, in almost all categories of crime, the rises in the rest of the country have been very much higher than in London. But I'm not happy that crime has gone up. Our most similar forces, Manchester, West Midlands, West Yorkshire, have gone up much faster than we have, and in many cases have a higher already rate per head of population. We've done this at a time of increased demand, expectations and stretch on resources, and as I've said already, going through some very major changes, the largest in our history.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you both. And I certainly accept, speaking for myself and perhaps on behalf of the committee, that it's a very difficult and challenging time these last 12 months. And I would like to take the opportunity also to thank our brave officers on behalf of the committee and on behalf of Londoners for keeping us safe, and accept the resource and challenges that you have. And when you respond, Commissioner, I'll be interested in your thoughts around the announcement this week on the extra 160 million, I believe it is, for counter-terrorism. I'm keen to investigate how much of that is coming London's way, and you may like to consider that when you respond. Notwithstanding that, my question really is about whether you are both separately and jointly satisfied with your record on tackling crime up to now. And I ask that question in the context of the figures, and we have seen serious violence at an unprecedented level. Stabilising is a word that you use, Commissioner, but stabilising at an unacceptable level. And also neighbourhood crimes at a very high level. There is a question within here, Chair, I hasten to add. And we've seen a period where sanction detections have gone in the wrong direction. So I would ask you again to comment, perhaps slightly more briefly than you did earlier, about the fact that are you, first of all, Mr Mayor, being elected to keep Londoners safe, are you satisfied with your performance based on those figures?
I'm never satisfied when there are victims of crime. I think none of us should be satisfied when there's even one victim of crime. What we can't do is have a sort of sliding door scenario where you have the last 2 and a bit years with a different mayor, different policies, different resources, and what we've done over the last 2 years. The best comparison I can do is compare ourselves with most similar forces, or the rest of England and Wales. And as the Commissioner I've mentioned in relation to answer to your opening question, actually in London, as unhappy as I am, and you've heard the Commissioner as unhappy as she is, about the increases in crime in our great city, the reality is you compare London to not just England and Wales, but most similar forces, and the increase has been less. I'll give you 3 examples which are relevant to the question you've asked. One is violence against the person. So violence against the person includes homicide, violence with injury, violence without injury, stalking and harassment. Across England and Wales, this has gone up by 21.9%. Across most similar forces, so think of West Midlands, West Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, gone up by 24.8%. In London, 4.5%. So we're not happy, 4.5% increase, we want it to go down, but comparing across that versus 24.8% most similar forces. Knife crime, big source of concern to our constituents and Londoners. Across England and Wales, gone up by 17% in the last year. West Midlands, comparable force, 18.2%. West Yorkshire, 26.8%. In London, we're not happy. It's gone up by 14%. Again, less than the increase you're seeing elsewhere. And the final one of the 3 I'll give you an example of is criminal damage and arson. Criminal damage and arson has gone up across the country by 1.9%. In London, it's gone down by 5.9%. So I'm giving you examples of, I think, the difference, I hope, that I've made comparing and contrast to other parts of the country where the increase has been higher.
I know the Commissioner is going to respond. I'm not sure Londoners would necessarily buy into a narrative that we are doing better than other forces when our levels are very, very high. I understand that narrative, but I don't think that really is probably good enough when we're looking at the figures at the moment. Commissioner, you may wish to comment.
So also, I'm not satisfied. Of course I'm not. I want to bear down relentlessly, particularly in relation to violent crime. Next year, I'm really looking for an improvement in our criminal justice outcomes. There are various areas where I think we should bring even more focus. With improved sort of understanding and tactics, we can get better. I am not satisfied. I don't want to sound complacent. I'm very proud of what my people have been doing, and I think it is relevant that despite the fact that London gets an enormous amount of attention, I completely understand that and I'm not complaining about it, actually other big cities are feeling this kind of change very strongly and more than us, and actually, despite what you say, Steve, in many categories they already have a higher per head of offences per head of population. Now, the British Crime Survey would tend to suggest that crime isn't going up as much as these recorded figures say, but what is of real concern is that serious violence has quite clearly across the country been going up, is going up in most places. I don't believe it is now in London, and next year we will be trying to force it back down. I'm not satisfied now.
Okay, thank you. You're right to end on that note, because serious violence is still the number one issue concerning Londoners. I was at a community meeting in Barking, Ulmesh's territory, during the week. A packed audience, passionate around it. My last point, really, if I may, you mentioned, Commissioner, about the Met turning into a truly modern organisation, embracing technology. We published a report around artificial intelligence suggesting that perhaps the Met and MOPAC are somewhat dragging their heels on that particular area. Would you like to comment, Commissioner, relatively briefly on that?
I don't think we are dragging our heels. There are certainly some services in the world who have gone further on some aspects of this than we have. But we are absolutely... I mean, there's a number of different areas in which we may think, as your report shows, we could use artificial intelligence, and we have been exploring some of those already. It's absolutely set out in my strategy for the next 5 years that we are going to transform so that we're not just a world-leading service, you know, in counter-terrorism, public order, neighbourhood policing, whatever it might be, but that we are seen as that in terms of our use of modern technology. We have a plan for that. I now have a leadership I've inherited from my predecessor, fantastic people in digital policing who've delivered some great things in the last year, which we'll probably talk about later on, in whom I have great confidence, and we are racing along with trying to get the best use of the information we have, allowing the officers at the front line to have the data they need to be able to do their job really well with modern techniques, and indeed using, where appropriate, subject to the law and sort of proper ethical frameworks, artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Assembly Member Bailey.
Morning, Mayor. Morning, Commissioner. Mr. Mayor, as you'll be aware, victim satisfaction is going down. So how will you be working with your Victims Commissioner to improve that situation?
I think as far as confidence of Londoners is concerned, it's stayed broadly the same for some time. There is concern amongst victims around a number of issues in relation to sanction detection that Senator O'Connell referred to in answer to the previous question, the information they receive, the quickness of response. At previous Mayor's question time, we raised the issue of 999 calls versus 101 and the response time it takes. So there are a number of issues upon which victims want better results. The work Claire Waxman is doing as London's first Victims Commissioner is predominantly working with victims and victims groups to understand the sort of feedback you're referring to, which aren't just numbers, but it's the experience that victims have. One is somebody being caught who's responsible for the criminality. Second is the experience the victim has, and that extends to, by the way, at the court and when they're cross-examined by the defendant counsel. So we're doing lots of work across the criminal justice system, not simply around policing, around the experience in court, speaking to judges and magistrates, but also simple things like, I'll give you one example. There have been examples where a person's been arrested, charged, prosecuted, sent to prison. When he's released from prison, the victim's not informed that the person's been released from prison. And so it's a whole range of things we're trying to do to improve the victim's experience. And the reason why it's important is we want people to come forward and report crime and be witnesses. And if you're not satisfied, you may not do so in the future.
We welcome the development of the victim strategy. That I think it's a good progress. But when can we expect that to be published?
Well, we've already had lots of works published in relation to victim strategy, and we're already starting to see a difference. So the violence against women and girls strategy was a consequence of speaking to victims. A number of strategies have been published. You'll be aware, Senator Bailey, that we've recently agreed a memorandum of understanding with the MOJ, which means we will be responsible for commissioning the victims' services in courts as well. So a lot of that work's taking place and a number of strategies have been published. I'm not sure which particular one.
Well, there's talk of a new victim strategy and we're wondering the delivery down on that. But just my last point, a bit of a plea really. Around knife crime in particular, many of the victims are that they know the perpetrator, there's a relationship there, and how they're dealt with is very important. And I wonder if that could be a bit of a, there could be an emphasis, a focus on that in any strategy going forward, because in particular communities, that relationship is causing real terror, and if the victims could be satisfied, that would make a real difference. But that's enough from me, Chair.
Chairman, on that, I mean, the Commissioner may want to come in, but my experience of speaking to officers is often the victims may well know who may have been involved in the act of violence, but for a variety of reasons is nervous, unwilling to come forward and give the information to the police, for reasons that we can understand. But I'd say this, the best, and again, the Commissioner's got infinitely more experience than I have, the best source of information that the police can have in relation to investigating a crime and detection is the cooperation of witnesses and victims, and the Commissioner can herself tell you some of the challenges the police have.
So I know you are right, of course. The vast majority of Londoners will go about their business without being troubled by knife crime. It's extremely unlikely for most of us most of the time. Sadly, there are areas of London communities, parts of those communities in which knife crime is very prevalent and in which people usually know the offender. We do face a real challenge in gaining their confidence and helping them to understand that we can assist and that a criminal justice outcome would be a good way to deal with this sometimes. There's lots of reasons for this fear, we understand it, but I take your point entirely that the way in which that usually young person is dealt with, for want of a better word, interacts with the officers and the other support services is absolutely crucial, even if on that instance they don't want to tell us. They won't give us their clothing, they won't give us their phone. It's very important that we treat them very well, and I think my Trident teams, for example, do that well. They understand that, my gangs teams understand that, and understand that it's important to talk with the family as well, similarly. But I'm sure there's more we can do here, and we have to kind of break this cycle, which is so difficult, where people are really reluctant to assist us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Thank you. Central to tackling crime is responding to 999 calls. And in July, 1,150 999 calls were diverted to police forces outside of London between the hours of 9 in the evening and 6 in the morning. So to start off with, I'd like to ask Mr Mayor, do you feel it's acceptable for emergency calls in London to be handled by forces outside the capital?
Well, I think, Chair, in percentage terms, it's very small in relation to the calls we're talking about. It's a reciprocal arrangement. And so, they come back to the Met Police Service in relation to once the call's been through a call centre. So I've got the numbers here, but in percentage terms, it's very small.
Does it concern you just even that those numbers are going to outside forces?
Of course it concerns me that as a consequence of government cuts. The amount of 999 handlers we have, the amount of 101 call handlers we have, the amount of people in the call centres we have are less than they should be. We're advertising now for more call handlers. There are still some vacancies. Clearly, the sooner we get all the call handlers in place, the less the delay will be for those ringing 999, but the less we'll have to rely upon the reciprocal arrangements we have with police forces outside of London. By the way, it is a two-way process, but in percentage terms, we're talking about a very small percentage.
Perhaps I could just ask the Commissioner, I've been contacted by the manager of Heaven nightclub in the West End, and he's incredibly concerned about call answering delays. So on one recent occasion, he was put on hold for 20 minutes after dialling 999. On another, he waited 8 minutes and before the call then went through to Hampshire Police. And really that feels to him, and I think to most of us, it's unacceptable, and he had to actually let some suspects go who he was holding. We know there's been an increase in call volumes. The Mayor's just suggested you're recruiting more call handlers. Is there a serious staffing issue at the Met's call centre?
There has been, undoubtedly, but I am optimistic about this. I'm not happy about what happened there and the man from Heaven having to release people. That is obviously not a good service. I absolutely accept that. You'll also understand there are occasions where all sorts of things are happening where we may not be able to provide, the service we would at a different time of day and in a different place. It is a good trajectory, though, Caroline. It honestly is. We now have a completely new way of dealing with 101, which, as you know, has been a big problem, and I'm sure all Assembly members will have had complaints about that. That was partly caused by old technology, which we've now changed, and partly by staffing gaps, and partly by huge increases in volumes. The last time I went into our call centre, there was actually no waiting time on 101 and no waiting time on the 999. That's not quite the norm, but we're not far off it a lot of the time now. So the 101 wait times, on average, in the last couple of months, has been 1.5 minutes or less. Yeah. That's the 101.
999 calls, as you say, have gone up by about 5% year to date, but we have managed through better working to reduce the actual deployments to emergency response requirements by about 10%. And we have been recruiting people after a failed campaign 2 years ago. We've been recruiting people very fast, good people coming in, enjoying themselves. I am absolutely clear that the call answering and call handling has got a lot better in the last 3 months and is going to continue to get better in the next several months. I'm convinced of that.
Chair, for the sake of completeness, which is really important we have completeness here, the number of calls made this summer to the Met were 625,640, 0.3% were redirected to other forces. This does not mean the responding force will not be the Met.
Okay, but a clear concern is that if there was a major incident, a terrorist incident, and people are being put on hold when they ring 999 for 20 minutes, that's a huge concern. So really I want to know what your message, whether it's maybe perhaps the Mayor, what's your message to this nightclub manager and other concerned businesses across the capital who really need assurances that when they need the police, they're going to be there and they can keep their customers and the streets safe?
Well,
I think that is really truly an extraordinary event that you have described there. You may have seen some other police chiefs talk about the struggles they had in the summer. We didn't suffer the same sort of huge increases in volumes as some of the other forces did, but I think it's the sign of a resilient system that we can divert calls around, and it's a reciprocal arrangement. And as I say, my message is, this is something that there will always be in the nature of policing moments of huge demand. During the heatwave, with the World Cup, and, there were hours that you could look at which were absolutely out of all kilter with a normal average day in terms of calls to the police. And we have a system which I think can deal with that really very well, and it's getting better and better. And my message to the man from heaven is I'm very disappointed that happened. I don't think it's anything like the norm and wasn't last summer, and I'm absolutely convinced this service is getting better literally week by week at the moment.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Desai.
My question to you, Mr. Mayor, is how will the Metropolitan Police Service meet future challenges for policing in London?
No. We're still dealing with the first question.
Tackling crime.
Do you want to reserve your comments to your table question?
Right.
Okay. So, Assembly Member Cooper.
Well,
Same. Sorry, I was indicating to ask my question.
Yes. But we are still dealing with the principal question. I have a list of people who wanted to comment on the first question, and Assembly Member Desai featured on that, followed by you.
Okay, I thought he was being called in to ask his question, so I indicated that I wanted to ask my question.
Okay.
Because,
all right. So, Assembly Member Arnold, are you actually on song with this one?
No, I can go with tackling crime. And it's my question is about really the prevention aspect. And I was asking about young people excluded and the evidence that there's been and the number of reports that there have been in the papers. In fact, in April, the Telegraph reported school exclusion, fuel rise in youth crime. And then in September 2018, there was an excellent report in the Times, exclusion from school drives rise in gang crime, and a report there that said the Home Office conducted a report linking exclusions with involvement in drug crime, with drug gangs. They haven't produced that report yet, and so I'd like to know, does the Commissioner know about this report, and does she accept that there is a link, given that study of UK prisoners found 63% of prisoners had been temporarily excluded in their lives and 42% had been permanently excluded. Now, I'm not suggesting that exclusion is directly linked to crime, but I'm just saying there's a body of evidence with more evidence needed to say that this is an area that surely the Met and the Mayor should be concerned about.
I completely agree. You know, I think we are very concerned about it. Some of our sort of small scale, not sort of full academic studies
show just what a high proportion of the young people being involved in very serious violence have been or are currently excluded from school, and it seems, you know, very, very high in all the small-scale studies we have done. There is absolutely a link, and I think most people would accept that. I don't think, and you're not saying this, we can't say cause and effect, and of course not everybody who is temporarily excluded from school will find themselves caught up in crime or serious violence. But it is a very important area for us. I know you know, the government are taking this seriously. I think there's the exclusions review has been being conducted by the Secretary of State who has responsibility for education. And in the serious violence meetings that both the Mayor and I go to, you know, it's very clearly on the agenda as a subject that we need to come together, understand better and do more about. So for us, we are, as you know, investing in schools officers, but not just schools officers. We're putting officers into pupil referral units, and we're working in our partnerships locally to with the, you know, youth offending teams and others, to and the schools, which are often, you know, the haven of safety for young people, to try to assist in their decision making about exclusion, not exclusion, but also if somebody is excluded, then what, and how do we keep track of them? And what is a bit frightening is the number of people who aren't in regular school, who never return to it, who kind of get slightly lost to our collective authorities, and that I think is not a good position.
Mr. Mayor, would you like to see a copy of this Home Office report? Will you write to see if you can get a copy of it?
Yeah, if I could
share it.
If I could just, of course, if I could just complete the picture, which is two things. One is, I think there is a link between crime currently taking place and young people excluded, but also a link between crime currently taking place and people excluded in the past. Obviously, we can understand why in exceptional circumstances an exclusion is the only option available to the head teacher. The evidence I've seen is there are some examples where schools try and keep children in the school, even if they've been excluded from the classroom. There's a school in something of Ashalomi's patch called Dunraven, which has done really good work about keeping the children inside the school, whereas other comparable schools would have excluded them. The Timpson review is taking place now by Ed Timpson, the former government minister. Sophie Linden has given evidence to Ed Timpson, and we're speaking to him and his team. Of course, as soon as I get the review, I'll make it available to colleagues in the Assembly.
Thank you.
Okay. Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner. At a Police and Crime Committee meeting at the beginning of September, when we were discussing officer safety, you said that no officers had ever mentioned the desire to have spit guards. Since then, on responses, 5,500 responses to a Metropolis survey, said that 95% of the officers were in support of the introduction of spit guards, which is a very big percentage, obviously. Do you trust that the officers are asking for these based on their experience and knowledge?
Oh, absolutely, I do, yes. I mean, just to be clear, what I said was that until it was mentioned at the Police Federation conference, no officer had said to me, and I spent a lot of time with them, or any of my senior colleagues, that this was an issue for them or a priority for them. And obviously spit guards have been available, licensed by the Home Office to be used for about 12 years. I introduced them in our custody suites. I'm pleased with that, how it has gone over the last year. Very sparingly used, well used, and in circumstances that absolutely required it, and as far as I'm aware, no complaints. What I said when we met at the PCC was that I'd asked the Federation colleagues to come up with evidence from colleagues about how they saw things and where they felt that spit guards might assist. They've done the survey, as you say, over 5,000 have responded. Of course, I trust what they are saying from their knowledge and experience. Unfortunately, the survey doesn't actually ask them the question about incidents where having a guard might have protected them. It's completely wrong that any officer should ever be spat at. I have been, many have. It's very prevalent, we discover, not least from the survey, and or bitten, even in some respects even worse. That is not acceptable. It is a crime. We will deal with it. Spit guards, of course, will only be used when somebody has already spat or bitten, and we don't have any data at the moment about the number of times in which they might be a protective measure, because we haven't got that prevalent. So I'm I am now doing some more work on that, and I'm also talking to colleagues up and down the country. I absolutely accept that this is something that my officers feel strongly about. You know why I have been very cautious about this, but I'm currently reviewing it again. And I absolutely have set out that I want my officers to feel supported. I want them to be as safe as reasonably they can be. And I'm looking at what protective measures we can take that will protect them better from the hazard of spitting, which sadly is all too prevalent.
I know one of your concerns was how it would look to outsiders with it. I've forgotten the word you used, but I know that was one of the concerns. Do you think that that should take precedence over the fact that clearly other forces have looked into it and think it's a good idea? None of us want our police officers spat at, and we really must protect them as best we can.
Sure.
And it's worked well in custody suites, and therefore, given that the BTP have the use of them on the streets of London, would it not send the right message to the frontline officers that have to deal with this abominable situation?
So again, to be clear, I was never concerned, and I never meant to give an impression that I was concerned about what you might call in modern parlance, the optics of this. What I'm concerned about is whether the use thereof is actually going to keep my officers safer or not. And I was concerned that once you try to place in a difficult, violent situation a spit guard on somebody, and we've seen some very vivid videos in the summer of some of the aggression that the officers are occasionally, in some areas, sometimes up against, that actually struggling to put a spit guard on would actually make a difficult situation very much worse. As soon as you have the spit guard on, you need to really, really carefully monitor how the person is and what is going on. And we know there have been some inquests in which the officers' actions have been called into very serious question. They've ended up being investigated for years about whether they did or didn't manage the spit guard properly. So it is not without its difficulties, and I think my colleagues around the country would say that too. But the context in London is different, in my view, and that's why I have been very cautious about it. It's not what somebody might think when they look, it's what they might think when they look, and then what they might do to make that situation less safe for the officers.
So to give comfort...
But it's under review, Susan. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, fair enough. But what sort of date do you think you might have come to a decision?
I've said to the Federation that we should come together in a matter of weeks, not months or years. So I'm doing the review as I speak, and I will be meeting with them in a matter of weeks.
Well, that is indeed good news. Thank you. Mr Mayor, what's your personal view on spit guards?
Well, it's an operational matter, and I support the Commissioner. So the Commissioner has talked about the spit hoods being available in custody suites. A good example of the Commissioner's operational expertise advising me about its importance, but a good piece of engagement in relation to making sure people are aware it's being used to reassure those involved. First it was in a part of London, then it was in the rest of London. There have been no problems. There is a proper accountability that reassures the Commissioner and reassures myself and the Deputy Mayor. If the advice from the Commissioner is to, subject to her review, to have officers in London using spit hoods, then obviously we make sure there's proper engagement. But you've got to make sure your police officers have all the tools available to keep themselves safe.
Yeah.
And anybody who's spoken to a police officer who's been spat upon, put aside the illnesses and the issues of health and safety, it is a horrible, horrible experience. And if it's the case that the spit hood's been available to Met police officers leads to officers being less spat upon, and some of the uncomfortable circumstances they go through having to happen, then I think it's a good thing.
Okay, thank you.
So Member Curtin.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to follow on from Assembly Member Arnold's question about the link between children who are excluded from school or people in general and then the propensity to get involved in crime. And I know, Commissioner, you said that correlation is not necessarily causation, but I wondered if both of you have considered something that you didn't mention that may be staring us in the face, which is family breakdown and fatherlessness, possibly is a cause for both of those things. And in London, among young people, there's an epidemic of fatherlessness, and this is particularly affects boys when they get to their teenage years. And I understand from figures that I have, this particularly affects Afro-Caribbean boys, where there's a rate of fatherlessness much, much higher than in the white community or in the Bangladeshi, Pakistani and Indian communities. Is that something that you've considered as something that affects the possibility of children and young people getting into crime? And I wonder if you've got any comments and thoughts on that.
Well, families come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And I'm not persuaded that a particular type of family necessarily leads to somebody getting involved in criminality. I am aware of, and I accept, that adverse childhood experiences can lead to children getting involved in criminality at a later age, children who've seen domestic abuse in their household, children in a family where there's been breakdown, children whose family members may be involved in drugs or substance abuse, and on. And the evidence from the work undertaken in Scotland and Wales is if you can address the deep societal issues, which include adverse childhood experiences, you can have a big impact in relation to preventing crime. And that's one of the motivations behind a violence reduction unit. That won't lead to crime going down overnight, but over a generation, in Scotland it was 10 years, you can make a real impact in relation to stopping young people necessarily get involved in criminality. I'm a firm advocate and believer in tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, smaller class sizes, shore staff facilities, parenting classes, youth services, invested in young people. So I'm not sure if I accept your thesis. Okay, let me rephrase that. I don't accept your thesis.
Well, I mean, all the things that you've said, youth services, smaller class sizes, are all very, very good. You did mention there children who have been from a family breakdown as one of the things. I noticed that you did say that among other possible traumatic experiences that children have. So perhaps you do partly accept my thesis.
Well, I speak from personal experience. When you speak to people who've been through an acrimonious divorce, it's horrible. It's horrible for those children. Or you speak to a young person whose family have had other forms of breakdown. It is horrible. I'm not sure I would not equate a type of family with the increase in violent crime we've seen. If you speak to criminologists, police officer experts and others about the reason for the increase in violent crime in particular, that's not the explanation they give.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. Oh, sorry, did you want to say something, Commissioner?
Well, I mean, I speak as somebody whose parents were divorced when I was 6 and my father died when I was 11, and I'm sure many other people in the room know lots of fatherless people who have, because of other protective factors in our lives, done well, if you like. I said goodbye to one of my senior officers the other day whose mother arrived from Ireland with £20 in her pocket and very successful senior officer, having left her violent husband. And she arrived, and all the girls have done fantastically well, and the boys as well. So fatherlessness per se, I'm slightly with the Mayor, but what we do know is there are a number of protective factors and a number of risk factors. And if you are going home to an empty house, if you are finding yourself without a role model that you can rely on, a safe adult that will give you good support and advice, you are absolutely at more risk. There's just no doubt about that.
Okay. Right.
And that's why, that's why the teacher, the police officer, the person in the youth centre, the other reliable adults can be so very important. And there's a variety of ways in which families break down and which children experience ghastly
Okay, well, I think I understand your thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member O'Connell.
Just very briefly, Commissioner, I may have misheard, but I did ask a specific question about the £160 million announcement. I know there's not a lot of detail around it, but I'll be interested in your observations.
We are always, as you know, quite careful not to break down counter-terrorist funding in public very much. No. Suffice to say, of course, we are relieved that there is funding in this form for counter-terrorist policing. And we had indeed been talking to the government about the necessity for that to continue the plans and the rate of work that we've been doing last year. We had a one-year settlement, if you like, last year. We've got another one-year settlement this year. Doesn't make planning for the long term that easy. And as you well know, Steve, I always say this, counter-terrorist grant funding is just but one thing in keeping the country safe from terrorism, and investment in wider policing in this whole system approach is absolutely vital. I'm afraid I cannot tell you how much, I genuinely don't know how much of that will come to London, but as a generally speaking, we are sort of 25% of the country in funding terms in general policing, rather more than that in counter-terrorism terms, because we lead for the country. So a considerable amount of that will come to the Met, will allow us to continue to maintain the scale of counter-terrorist police that we currently have, and indeed the recruiting we're currently doing from the last financial year.
Thank you. I mean, I think our committee will be writing to government lobbying for the lion's share, shall we say, putting it back. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we have the table question of Assemblymember Desai, which relates to future challenges.
Thank you, Chair. The biggest challenge facing the future of policing in London is the combination of rising demand alongside continued cuts. At the start of this week, the government had the opportunity to use the budget to announce more funding for the Met. With government claims of an end to austerity, we all had high hopes that we might see an end to the massive cuts to our police service. But it's now clear that the Home Secretary's warm words about prioritising police funding were just that, warm words with no action. From City Hall, I'm investing a record amount in the Met, an extra £138 million, but compared to £1 billion worth of cuts from the government, this is just a drop in the ocean. And it's not just crime that has driven an increase in demand on policing. Cuts to local authorities, health, social care and youth services also means that policing as the service of last resort is being forced to pick up the pieces. Our hard-working police officers and staff are doing everything they can to respond to these increases in demand. But we can't escape the fact that we now have the lowest number of officers since 2003 and the lowest number of police officers per head in 20 years. This means that the Met is going to have to continue making hard choices about how they prioritise their work. I'll continue to support the Commissioner in making the tough but right choices based on the evidence, such as the transfer of 122 officers from the Road Traffic Command into the City Hall Funding Violent Crime Task Force. Added to this, in 5 months' time, the UK is due to leave the EU. With time rapidly running out, the government is leading us towards two possibilities, either a bad Brexit deal or worse still, no deal at all. Both of these scenarios could have dire consequences for the security of our city. Crashing out of the EU without a deal would not only mean unravelling the legal framework of cooperation with the EU, but also impact the Met's everyday operations. And that's why we're ensuring the Met is fully engaged in Brexit planning, and that's why we're working to understand the implications of a no-deal Brexit on policing across London.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Two questions, one of you, Commissioner, and then if I can come to you, Mr. Mayor. So, Commissioner, you talked about looking forward to the future. Well, let's look forward to 2019, and I won't go too far into the future. And I want to ask you about your approach to policing, both philosophically and operationally, because obviously one underpins the other. And in the last 24 hours, you have had two forceful interventions by two of your colleagues. So, Lynn Owens of the National Crime Agency talked about 4,600 gangs costing the UK economy some £37.3 billion a year, 50% rise over the last 5 years. A problem was in terrorism. She said that earlier this year as well. Used more or less the same was yesterday. And then you had Sarah Thornton talking again yesterday, or this morning rather, of prioritizing what she calls core policing issues over, quotes, deserving issues. Now, you talked about traditional values in your opening statement to us earlier this morning. So what are your traditional values? Are they those of Sarah Thornton? I mean, can you expand on your views? And in particular, in particular, in light of your approach and your views, how would you then take that into giving proper support and training to your officers to tackle the challenges that they face?
Thank you. When I talked about traditional values, what I meant was policing by consent. I meant local policing, and I meant in particular our sort of core values of courage, of professionalism, of integrity, and of compassion. And that's, you know, quite historic and old-fashioned in a sense, but I'm contrasting that with the need to be very modern in our approach, and in particular in our use of technology. And you'll know what we've done in the last few years in relation to that, and what's coming this year probably, Umesh. In terms of the focus and the priority, I set out when I arrived saying violent crime is too high in London, and that will be my priority. I define it broadly from terrorism through to sexual offences and child protection, and street violence, of course, and domestic abuse, but violent crime will remain the priority. I've said already that I think we should improve our criminal justice outcomes. I absolutely agree with Sarah. There's never been a fag paper between us on this, and if you've listened to things I've said over the years, I've absolutely said this, that we should, when I arrived, I said we are not going to be investigating people who are deceased unless there is prima facie a conspiracy in which other people are still alive. We have not been going back and investigating the past.
To interject, Commissioner, because I'm limited for time, so sorry to interrupt you. No doubt, I'm sure you and Sarah and people talk to one another every day. So I knew what
so
the
I'm
answer
with
would
Sarah.
be.
That's probably the quick way to answer it.
Coming to you, Mr. Mayor, so the Assembly passed a motion, which I proposed, in fact, unanimously, asking you to write to the Home Office to ask for a fair and funded pay rise for police officers. However, police officers in London will receive a real terms pay cut for this year after the Home Secretary rejected the Independent Police Remuneration Review Body's recommendations on police pay. The Commissioner described this quote as a punch on the quote nose for police officers, unquote. So how do you propose taking this campaign forward, both in terms of police pay, and again I propose the motion to the Assembly on police pay, and in cuts? What new directions are you thinking of? And very specifically, as reported in yesterday's Guardian and other papers, the proposed police challenge to the Treasury calculation of the money each force pays into the police pension scheme. Can I ask you, Mr. Mayor, will you support this legal challenge, just like you're supporting the Heathrow legal challenge, or will you consider supporting this challenge by the police to the attack on their pension scheme?
Chair, it's very difficult to answer a long, complex, multifaceted question in brevity. I'll do my best. It's just worth understanding that the police are very different from most employees or workers in the country. They've not got the same employment rights to go on strike, protest about paying conditions, and on. It's for that reason the government decided to have a police remuneration and pay review body. It's an independent body. They make a recommendation. What the expectations were, they'd accept the recommendations and fund the recommendations. I'm afraid the government has not accepted the recommendations of this body, and that's one of the reasons why the Commissioner and myself are worried about things like morale of our police service, are worried about how much stretch we can have from them when they're under-resourced. I mean, they are cancelling rest days. They are cancelling leave. So, of course, I'm concerned to make sure we give them the support they need, and that includes a decent pay, a decent pension. In relation to the pension changes, the reason why it's of such concern to chief constables and those in senior positions is the choice they've got to make is to fund the pension contributions as an employer versus police officer numbers. And it's a straightforward equation in relation to the contribution they've got to make. And I'm hoping the government will consider funding the additional employer contributions that police forces across the country are now being told they've got to pay.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to stay on the subject of resources, if I may. But before I just turn to that, I just wanted to say something to echo Assembly Member O'Connell. I meet regularly with Sally Benatar, who's the South West Basic Command Unit commander, and with her predecessors, Richard Smith, Peter Laverick, and so on, Steve Wallace. They've all been absolutely fantastic, and I can see that the work that's being done just in that area of transformation, let alone all the stuff around new technology, increased use of 101. So the police are really stepping up, and I feel really confident that you've got some excellent officers who are really pushing through in, you know, quite an intense period of change. But I think it makes it really hard for them that it's all being done in the context of very constrained resources. And that is something that has continuously come up since I was elected in May 2016, that resources are very small. And I noted what you said to the Home Affairs Select Committee, which was that we see a huge rise in expectations and demand that's putting a massive strain on our people, and it can't go on without hard choices being made. Either more money comes in, or the mission is smaller, or we have to have a greater appetite for risk. Now, I'd like to actually ask the Mayor, after the really bitter disappointment of the budget, do you agree with the Commissioner that we need to move in one of those three directions?
Yeah, can I say this? I mean, I say this without wishing to flatter the Commissioner. I can't imagine an incoming Commissioner having a tougher set of circumstances than she has had. We know as politicians the increased demands constituents place upon us, rightly so. The same goes more so with police officers, and they are no longer the port of last call, they're the port of first call for many of the issues, mental health issues, other issues that they're having to grapple with. One of the jobs the Commissioner's got to do is to advise me how she can best manage workloads that her and her officers have to do with fewer resources. And I have to rely upon the expert advice from the Commissioner and her team, because I'm a politician, I'm not trained in this area. We haven't got an American system where amateurs try and do policing. And so it's really important that Deputy Mayor Sophie Linden works very closely with the Deputy Commissioner, Assistant Commissioners, but I rely upon the advice the Commissioner gives me. And the description of her phrase as traditional policing is, I think, right. Our priority's got to be, violent crime. Our priority's got to be dealing with victims compassionately, encouraging them to come forward. But it means tough choices. The Commissioner and myself having to ration finite, diminishing resources in the way we think best addresses the needs of our city.
So can I ask you, Commissioner, what might smaller mission look like for London?
What we've seen is a huge increase in, for example, reports of certain types, as you're well aware. So, doubling and tripling of domestic violence reporting. Probably not an increase in the prevalence at that rate, but nevertheless. The indecent images online and other online crimes, rising almost exponentially. The volume of data that we have to wrestle with to do an investigation digitally, and then to be able to disclose that effectively in a court process. I could go on. These are all, I'm not wringing my hands here, I'm not moaning, it's what's happening, it's happening around us. And some of those things we have very little discretion about, and others we probably have more discretion about. We are undoubtedly, on occasions, substituting for other public services, and I am beginning to take a harder and harder line on what we do there and where we do it. I do some of that with a heavy heart, but I actually think that the police are being asked to do functions that we're not as well skilled for. It's not appropriate for us, and to get back to the priority and the core, we will have to stop doing some of that. You'll be very well aware that we deal with in terms of investigation, probably proportionately more and better than the rest of the country, but we deal with a very low proportion of frauds, and online fraud in particular has been increasing hugely. I have no intention of increasing the numbers of those that we deal with. I fear that every single person around this room will have some issue which is very close to their heart, which if I had all the resources in the world I would do more of and I'd do better. But the mission has been getting wider and wider, new things like online child sexual exploitation and child sex exploitation generally, very important. Risk management in safeguarding in a way we never dreamt of 5 years ago. We do have to make some hard choices, and I am sort of staring down the barrel of several of them as we speak. And that is why, I can be, if you like, criticised for not doing A or B to the platinum standard. Caroline didn't go any further with response.
But I have no intention of trying to improve our response times further. I think they're good. I'm very happy with them. There are many people who think they should be better. I don't see lives being put at risk. I'm not going to put further effort into that. I could go on. Policing has always had to make hard choices. We've always had to flex and surge. If something terrible happened out there now, as you know, the Met would just change shape immediately and respond to it. And we are doing that all the time.
Well, I think that the reduction in police spending has been unfair on Londoners. I could ask you more, Commissioner and Mr Mayor, but I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Assembly Member Dismore.
Thank you. Commissioner, the Mayor talked about Brexit in his remarks just now. With the Brexit negotiations deadline rapidly approaching, what would be the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the capital's security and resilience, in your view?
I think everybody here would agree that it's actually very hard to predict that in specific ways. What we know, and you will have, perhaps some of you have seen the evidence that Lynn Owens and DG of the NCA and my colleague Richard Martin, who leads for me and for the police chiefs nationally, said at the Home Affairs Select Committee just 2 days ago. There are a number of instruments that we currently use, some of which we can automatically access, some of which are just very fast, which in a no deal would become either unusable or we have to find a substitute which is slower and more expensive and will have to be used more sparingly. It will take, in a no deal scenario, it would take more officers undoubtedly just to manage some of the key inquiries, key investigations that we must do to keep our citizens safe. Equally, we are planning, as you know, in a sober and careful way with others about the contingencies should there be, in a no-deal scenario, shortages of particular goods and that kind of thing. Should there be delays on the motorways? Should there be protests outside Parliament in any scenario? We're doing all of this, but it's very much sober, calm, based on sensible planning assumptions. And as we, go through the days and weeks, it will become clearer and clearer what the scenario is and really how people are feeling about that. And we stand ready. I can't convert that into a sort of metric of changed risk or security change. It's just not possible because there's so much that is unknown.
Well, one thing that came up from the National Police Coordination Centre on a no-deal Brexit, they warned that the Metropolitan Police officers who are non-British EU nationals could lose their warrant cards. I think there's currently 820 of them. Can you explain why and what the consequences of this would be?
I know that they have said that, or at least I've seen it's reported that they have said that. I simply think, to quote many other people, that is an unthinkable scenario. I don't believe that will actually happen. I would be astonished if it did. Of course, if we did find, we have a large number of police staff who are EU citizens as well, some of whom are feeling rather unsettled, of course. But I remain confident that those members of staff and indeed police officers will be able to continue with their work with us, which they enjoy doing, which they do very well, bring us a great deal of diversity in the coming months and years.
Meg, given your 6 Brexit red lines on policing, do you think the Conservative government understands or cares about the implications of a no-deal or bad-deal Brexit that it would have for Londoners' safety and security?
Well, I'm sure they care about it. The proof is in the pudding. I was in Brussels on Friday and met with the EU Commission on Security, Sir Julian King. A British person is in charge of security across the EU. That will no longer be the case at 11 p.m. on March 29th if we leave the European Union. I think what's really important is we get as best as we possibly can, clearly. You know my views in relation to a public vote. There is a real concern about things slowing down, as the Commissioner has said. I think the government does understand the need for an arrangement with the EU on security. The last meeting I had with David Davis before he resigned, we discussed the issue of security, and he understood, and I'm sure Dominic Raab does, the reason why the collaboration with the EU is so important to our safety, but also to the safety of our colleagues, allies and friends in the European Union as well.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member Eshalomi.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Mayor, Commissioner, you've both talked about the Violence Reduction Unit, and the reality is, yes, we've seen a massive reduction and massive increase in knife crime across the capital this year. And you both touched on the fatal stabbing in Southern Park yesterday. There was also a double shooting, I'm sure you're aware, quite close to Crystal Palace in my constituency. And I welcome the news that you've set up the Violence Reduction Unit in terms of how we address and take a different approach to tackling violent crime. But do you really think that this is going to have a big impact on tackling violent crime across the capital?
Not for some time. And let me be quite clear. The Violence Reduction Unit by itself won't solve all the violent crime overnight. In Scotland, it took 10 years. Experts advise us it's a generational change. It's part of a package of measures we're doing, albeit with limited resources, to try and tackle this issue. So you'll have heard us talk about the knife crime strategy. Each borough now has a knife crime plan. The Met Police has made sure those plans are levelled up. They're not just great pieces of work, but they're actually been actioned as well. On a daily basis, the Met Police operation looks at what's happening in different boroughs. You'll be aware that there are some boroughs with a higher volume of violent crime, knife crime than others. So the work of the Violent Crime Task Force, which began earlier in this year, is focused towards the high crime boroughs. That's been increased now to more than 270 officers. But I don't want you to be under a misapprehension that mainstream policing isn't tackling also violent crime. They really are. And one of the things that gives me confidence that police officers have got confidence using, for example, targeted intelligence-led stop and search, is we've had the biggest rollout of body-worn videos of anywhere in the world. So it's part of a package of measures. But I've got to say this. There are fewer than 30,000 officers in our city at a time when our population has never been greater, 9 million. Each day, 1.5 million additional visitors come to our city. So in addition to making sure concerts are taking place safely, demonstrations are taking place safely, diplomats properly protected and people who need protection, and all the other things that the police does in a capital city, they're also doing that at the same time, and it's very, very tough.
Commissioner, notwithstanding the discussions we just had on budget, so yes, there is a role, and we have seen a reduction in budgets, but do you feel that MOPAC's crime reduction role will have an impact on frontline policing? Because I think some of the concerns from constituents is with the response times of when they're going to police front counters, which many are closing. So do you think that additional crime reduction unit will have an impact on frontline policing?
The Violent Crime Reduction Unit. I agree with the Mayor that it certainly won't in the first instance. In relation to violent crime, you know, there are a lot of people doing a lot of good work around the city in terms of early intervention, in terms of prevention, in terms of trying to support people who have kind of gone off the rails, if you like. But the major kind of impact, I think, at the moment in terms of stopping that rise and having it plateau and now beginning in many categories to come down has come from the huge efforts of the women and men of the Met. And we are leading, if you like, with the enforcement work. Now, the government has put in has their violent crime strategy, and they have put more money into some of the funds which will support the longer term work. As the Mayor said, we're bringing together all the local authorities and working really closely with them. I think there are some really good plans that we have across all the partnerships. But in the short to medium term, neither those nor the Violence Reduction Unit will actually be making an impact on the street tonight. I think, you know, this is about policing at this stage. But if you look at, you know, people quote Scotland a lot, look at Scotland and other places where they've set about, you know, really taking on the issue of violence. Very different phenomenon in Scotland, but nevertheless, you know, had a 10-year strategy, and that's what some of this Violence Reduction Unit is about. It's about London in 10 years' time and 5 years' time, as well as, you know, our work to stop things happening tonight.
Mr Mayor, finally, on this side, we'll continue to lobby the government to say we do need more money, and the reality is that the Met, you know, Commissioner's also alluded to the fact that austerity has had an impact. Is there anything else that you think can be done to lessen that impact, and in terms of, you know, actually what else the austerity measures are going to have an impact on violent rising crime?
Can I just make this point, Flo, which is really important to make? I wouldn't want anyone to think that the Met Police isn't striving to have more efficiencies. I mean, some of the transformational change, it's not simply getting new IT, important though that is. It's also working in a far more swift and nimble way. So the amount of police staff that have gone, the amount of CSOs that have gone, aside from the police officers that have gone, front counters that have gone, 32 borough units to now 12 basic command units, and on and on. And so austerity has led to some efficiencies having to be made by necessity, but they've been, some of them for the good, actually. Body-worn videos, the tablets, and so forth. My view is there's only so far you can have officers who are human beings stretched. There's only so far a public service can be under-resourced. I genuinely think there is a link between the cuts in police resourcing and the increase of violent crime. If you speak to criminals, and I sometimes do in my job, one of the things that gives them confidence is the fact that they're less likely to be caught. They're less likely to be caught with fewer officers than with more officers. This is the statement of the blindly obvious. And that's why it's really important we continue to lobby the government for more monies. There's no good politicians, simply talking the talk when it comes to when they speak to officers. They've got to walk the walk by making sure the Chancellor and Prime Minister invest in our policing.
Thank you.
So, Member McCartney.
Thank you. My question is to the Commissioner, because I raised this with the Mayor, the last Mayor's questions, but it's about the future challenges of disclosure, particularly with the onset of social media and the digital information that's out there. And I particularly want to focus on concerns that have been raised with regards to survivors of rape and the it appears differing practices at various police forces on the extent to which they require disclosure of that digital information. I know the Mayor's Victims Commissioner is extremely concerned about this and has written both to the Information Commissioner and to the government. But what it appears is that the Met is one of those forces that appears to be requesting unfettered access to survivors' information, which is raising great concerns about personal information not reasonably related to any investigation that may be disclosed. Can you offer reassurances on that, Commissioner?
Well, this I do see the more general point about the volume of data is one of our very biggest challenges. Umesh said, what are the key challenges? This is a huge challenge for us currently. You're all aware of the sort of exponential rise in the use of devices. The average household now has about 10. They are chock full of data. Then there's the deleted data. Then there's the cloud data. This has completely transformed the way in which certain types of offences, domestic abuse, human trafficking, and of course sexual offences have to be investigated. And we are, across policing, and not just in this country, really struggling with this tsunami of data. And we are talking all the time. Just 2 nights ago I was talking again with the tech industry about this, how they can help us, back perhaps partly to Steve's point about artificial intelligence and what we can do, because it is obviously completely unreasonable for us to do the modern day equivalent of, seizing somebody's whole house and garden shed and everything and bringing it all to the police station and then going through it page by page by page and item by item. But that is kind of what's having to happen at the moment with the digital data. We are in a really difficult place. We're working very hard on the technology, and we are working very hard on our joint disclosure plan that we have with the Crown Prosecution Service, which is a national plan to respond to the very serious concerns that were raised after the Allen case and others at the back end of last year. And you'll know that we are doing very much better in terms of the number of our officers, for example, who have received training recently on disclosure. The quality of our files has gone up quite considerably recently, the CPS would say. We are getting better at disclosure, and we're doing this to national standards, joined up with the National Police Chiefs Council. I know that the Victims Commissioner has a view about the form that we use when we are talking to victims. Of course, it is just a form. We are reviewing that as we speak.
it is all about how the officer also speaks to the complainant, the victim, at that moment in time. I don't believe there's a massive disparity around the country. I was talking to Martin Hewitt about this again this morning. Actually, we are very joined up with the rest of the country. We have to comply with the law and the law on disclosure, and we have to give people a reasonable understanding in the circumstances of both the necessity to take a device and to look at the material and what the requirements of disclosure may be in any criminal process. We've got to do that sensitively, we've got to do that well. I'm happy to work with the Victims Commissioner to make sure that in London we're as good as anybody else, but I met with the CPS on this subject last week and they said, Cressida, we're not quite sure that there is any big difference between you and others actually. So further to go.
I think that last point is very well made, and actually, you know, looking at the disclosure requirements, it's to disclose information to a defendant that has followed all reasonable lines of inquiry.
Yeah.
So I think it's that reassurance that it is reasonable, but it's not going to go quite wider, because the danger is, unless you can give that assurance, the number of survivors who will report may be in danger of reducing.
I think that's exactly right, and in fact all the sort of controversy around disclosure I fear may have reduced confidence in some victims. I'm sure it may have done. I do think it's somewhat unfortunate that the headlines that accompanied the Victims Commissioner's comments may also have had that effect, when I don't see it as such a very great issue, in fact. But we will be having continuing conversations with her and others.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I just ask, I think in 2017, in terms of the homicides concerning domestic abuse was around 8. It may be 9 in that sense. This year to date, it's been around 19. I've not included any murders that occurred at the weekend. Can you just update us about what the Met is doing to target the most dangerous perpetrators? It's to the Commissioner, I think, rather than to the Mayor. Question.
So this is an area of concern to me, Len, and we will be bearing down on this as part of our bearing down on violence next year. You'll know that the reports have been going of domestic abuse have gone up very considerably over the last few years. That said, the prevalence in London, according to the National Crime Survey, is lower than many places, in fact most of the rest of the country, it appears, and hasn't been going up in the same way as the recorded crime. But what does concern me is of course the homicides, and secondly repeat offending. And we've seen a slight increase in the last sort of several months of repeat offending, which is an area in which I really think we can do more and will do more. Amongst those homicides, there are many which you would have to say, ghastly though they are, it's very hard to know what exactly the police or indeed any other public authority might have been able to do to prevent it. So, for example, there are many, a number, where the offender, I have to be careful what I say now because many of them are coming to court and would be sub judice, but many where the offender has only just arrived in this country. Many where no party was known to the police whatsoever, and on a cursory look across all our records, not to any other public authority either. And therefore our opportunity for intervention seems, on the surface at least, to have been zero. Nevertheless, we are not, in my view, at the moment, distinguishing enough between the intimate partner domestic violence and other forms of domestic violence. And within the numbers that you're talking about, of course, there are a wide range. And the risk factors are different for both. Where I want us bearing down is in those areas of intimate partner domestic violence. Of course, when the one or other party has already come to notice already, that we do our absolute best to safeguard the victim and prevent reoffending, and that's a really key thing. We will look at repeat victimisation and reoffending. And you'll know that my new Deputy Commissioner, Sir Steve House, had a massive impact on domestic violence in Scotland, and is very interested in helping me with some of the things I think we can do to improve it further. I know you've been working with this for years, and it's close to your heart. The officers are dedicated, they're working hard, I think they're doing their best.
I think there is quite a bit more that we need to do next year to try, but as I say, some of these are very hard to see how to try to prevent those ghastly homicides.
And in some ways, you've got Operation Dauntless Plus. Now, this is quite an interesting figure. These are the most, the threshold to be a perpetuator that comes under your view for a different focus in terms of preventing crime, is they would have had to commit 3 separate offences across 3 different boroughs. Now, I think you've identified 500 individuals, truly people of violence, to have clocked up that, and probably, dare I say, some of them would have clocked up other misdemeanours as well.
Absolutely.
Around that. Are you in a position to give us a flavour of that work? Is that what you're aiming to build on next year in the coming, in terms of the future plans of the Met?
So that's one area that we definitely are going to continue and bear down on. We have currently too many outstanding offenders adrift, if you like, and in fact this very next month we will be focusing hugely on those high-risk offenders who have got lost somewhere, the fugitives, if you like, and absolutely we will be building on the Dauntless approach.
And thank you for that, Commissioner. But bearing in mind, so the issue of managing risk, and particularly those people that get lost in the system, and where there have been cases of where other interventions may have saved people's lives, either the principal victim or their children in that issues, is about the abuser's list. Now, of course, there are issues to be ironed out. Do you feel having a system based on the sexual offenders list will help you identify those who are most risk to people in our community that needs protection, but also in terms of clarifying the issue of disclosure? There are still problems with Clare's law about victims or potential victims getting access to information that possibly could save them from harm and others from harm. Have you got a view on that? Yeah. We have been working, the Assembly's been working informally with the Metropolitan Police Service, as well as your Chief Officer's lead officer, about managing risk and where we get to and what would give you better advantage in tackling this crime.
So we are introducing, under the leadership of Sue Williams, who you know, the PCU commander in Hackney and Tower Hamlets. She leads for us on this sort of thematic across the Met. So we're introducing a new kind of performance management dashboard in relation to domestic abuse, and the use of so-called Clare's law will feature in that. That is important. And I know you know what I'm going to say here, Len, I'm not completely convinced that a sort of very long list of potential risky offenders is the answer for us. I think it slightly takes me back to some of my previous answers. Managing risk that people may pose is a very resource-intensive piece of work. If you think of our sex offenders register, it's huge. It gets bigger by the day. That's inevitable. It just will go on, and we're engaged in a lot of offender management now, knocking on the door, talking to them, making sure they're not doing this or that, and all that kind of thing. Some of which is really useful, I am sure, and some of which takes us absolutely away from the sort of Sarah Thornton approach of actually we need to bear down on violent offenders and get them arrested and get them charged and bring them to justice. When you spend a lot of time checking on people in terms of risk management, safeguarding people in terms of risk management, you're not actually doing the core USP of policing, which is bringing people to justice. So I think there's a balance here. Dauntless is great. These are really violent, repeat people. We should be doing that. I'm not convinced that every single domestic violence offender should be on a register and we have to go and knock on the doors.
Nor do I.
Good.
Nor do we. And that's the issue. But I'll leave it there, Mr Mayor. We'll no doubt return, Chair, we'll return to this issue.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Sahota.
Mr Mayor, this is a question for you on terrorism. The past 3 years have seen the number of arrests for terrorism double compared to the 3 years before that. What impact will your counter-violent extremism programme have on safeguarding vulnerable people and stopping the spread of extremist ideology?
Well, I think it's really important to disaggregate the excellent work the police, security services do in relation to the enforcement side of terrorism. You've mentioned the fantastic work they've done in relation to arresting people before they do bad things in our city. You'll have heard the phrase shift, not a spike, in relation to what we're seeing. But there's an equally important piece of work to stop people becoming radicalised, preventing them becoming violent extremists in the first place. Part of that is resilience, giving people the resilience to reject radicalisers, whether it's far right or whether it's Islamist radicalisers. Part of it is protecting vulnerable people. Not everyone is resilient. Not everyone can be made resilient. How you protect vulnerable people. And we've got a huge role to play. And what we're doing at this stage is making sure we're speaking to communities. I think we've had, over the last period, the team's has met over 900 stakeholders and community members to make sure we understand what the area is, to get their confidence. And then we'll be going forward, I think, early next year with some recommendations about what more we can do. You'll have seen what Neil Basu and Mark Rowley said in relation to the threat is now, there's a threat also from the far right. You'll know, of course, about the Finsbury Park case. So we've got to make sure we evolve in relation to what the evolving themes are.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the answer. The next question is to you, Commissioner. Of course, you've heard what the Mayor has said, and also sharing information is important for both addressing extremism and also for addressing terrorism. And of course, in September, the Deputy Commissioner, Sir Craig Mackay, told the Police and Crime Committee that Brexit could make us less safe in terms of counter-terrorism, and that if there is a no deal on security, a patrolling officer will not get the alerts from international networks, which we currently get, and we will know less about people from this country travelling abroad committing criminality. So are you concerned that the Brexit may impact on our ability to receive and share information from our European policing partners?
I am concerned, yes I am. I think it's important to say that the structures and relationships and indeed law, if you like, which covers the work of the intelligence agencies is of course different from ours. And we and they have very, very good bilateral relationships. The Met with all our counterparts in every single EU country, and that will continue. And we will seek, of course, terrorism above everything else, to make sure that information is exchanged effectively and lawfully, and that we work together, particularly because a lot of terrorist plots are highly transnational in a variety of different ways. So we will continue as best we possibly can with whatever frameworks we have. But yes, I am concerned. I think I should also say, though, one of the other unknown unknowns is exactly how the border will work in the future. And, it's not, we have probably concentrated in our conversations, because we've been asked publicly about this, on the risks of the changed frameworks, the slower, the more expensive, the unable to do some things, if we don't get a good sort of arrangement with the EU in the future. But it may well be that in some aspects where borders are dealt with differently, we will actually know a little more about some EU citizens or some people who've travelled in from with the EU into this country. So that again is very hard to measure and to know, but I am extremely concerned, and like other police chiefs, I'm talking to my colleagues and indeed travelling to the other European countries quite a lot to talk about how we prepare together for whatever the scenario may be.
Thank you for your answer, Commissioner. Thank you.
My question is to the Mayor. It's about hate crime issues. How effectively are you tackling hate crime, and what support are you providing to victims and wider communities so that they have reassurance as well as the confidence to report such incidents?
Can I just first say this? I mean, it's just worth restating the impact that hate crime can have in relation to the ripples of fear that people will feel when they hear about hate crime. So I have spent some time this week speaking to Jewish Londoners. I was at JW3 this week with Sir Steve House and many others. And the murders in a synagogue in Pittsburgh have had a huge impact on the community here in London and across our country, an example of the consequences of those ripples of fear that I talked about. And that's why it's really important for us to appreciate the impact this has in relation to the communities that are affected: Jewish community, Muslim community, hate crime to do with race, disability, sexual orientation, and on. It's really important that we understand in a diverse city like London, unfortunately, one of the downsides is hate crime can occur. So as part of the work that community safety units do, they also do really invaluable work about reassuring communities about hate crime, how to report it. One of the good pieces of work we've done over the last period is the online hate crime hub. A lot of this stuff takes place virtually on the internet, social media. Really important we tackle that, but also work with the social media companies. Why aren't social media companies being more proactive, invested in AI, algorithms, so we reduce human being time, reduce taxpayer time, and get the private sector social media companies doing far more. But it's really important we give Londoners the confidence to report circumstances where they've been the victims of hate crime.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To the Commissioner, in terms of what actually happens on the ground, in my borough, in my constituency, in Brent, in September, we had an incident at Al-Husseini Mosque where a car was driven into the mosque. And then we had two incidents at a local temple in Harrow where banners were burnt. Now, my concern, my question is, how effectively are you able to deal with such incidents whereby not only individuals but organizations and wider communities require reassurance as well as ongoing support? Do you have resources to provide that effectively, or are you really stretching and that is actually showing in delivery of service, which is so critical for the community at large?
So this does remain, for all the reasons that you've both said, a very high priority area for us. On an average day in London, we would expect to see about 50 or 60 hate crime offences recorded, or reported to us rather. The vast majority of those are are either online and or at what you might call the the less serious end of the spectrum. It's relatively rare for us to have what I would think of as a very serious offence. However, all of them are unpleasant for the person on the receiving end of them. I do think that we are responding well to the type of incident you've talked about, and I must say both of those were very serious and nasty in quick succession in your borough, and unusual in that way. And you'll know that we've worked closely with the affected institutions, and we were able to put on extra patrols, and we're able to help with crime prevention advice, and we're able to be there, just as after the Pittsburgh attack, and I indeed met, as it happened, with the Chief Rabbi yesterday morning, but after the Pittsburgh attack, we're very quick to respond with our reassurance messaging, our conversations with members of the community and the wider community about what is the impact, how are people feeling, where will they be, where do we need to be, and getting extra patrols out there. We don't bring as high a number of people to justice, again, as I would like for these crimes, but we do have, as you know, well-trained, dedicated staff. We have hate crime liaison officers on every borough, and within our community safety units, people who are very skilled at investigating, and we have better and better third-party reporting mechanisms, and I think we are getting to hear about more and more. So it remains a priority. Yes, we're stretched across a lot of areas, but it's something we take very seriously. It's horrid to be on the receiving end of it. Equally importantly is the sort of strategic impact. If there is either a very serious incident or repeated incidents, it can cause very strong community tensions quite quickly, even in our great, diverse, and mostly very much at ease with itself city.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. We welcome pupils from the Foxfield Primary School in Woolwich. Now Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr Mayor, my question first is to you first of all, and it's on the IOPC investigations process. How do you work with the Independent Office for Police Complaints to ensure the police are held to account in a just and timely manner?
Well, can I say it is really important in a democracy that the police are properly policed and that the checks and balances take place. I think this is the third iteration of structural police accountability that I've experienced in my adult life, where there was a police complaints authority, there was the IPCC, and now the IOPC. Sophie Linden, the Deputy Mayor, meets regularly with the London Director. We have a presence on the relevant oversight committee of the IOPC. The thematic reviews that the IOPC undertakes are really important. We obviously don't look into, for good reasons, we don't go into individual cases for obvious reasons. And there are some interdisciplinary issues, or some matters that overlap between the police. Could be mental health, there could be other issues where we take a huge interest, but at least on a quarterly basis, we'll meet regularly with the IOPC to make sure we're learning the lessons, particularly the thematic reviews, to make sure that there is the relevant accountability and lessons learned from investigations that they conduct.
Thank you. If I could turn to the Commission now, and I first of all, before I carry on, I appreciate the sensitivity, of course, in commenting on any individual cases. But the reason I'm asking this question is after the terrible murders of 4 young men by Stephen Port, and the police had missed chances to catch Mr. Port, and yet in the IOPC investigations, only 1 of 17 police officers interviewed freely answered questions. 16 officers provided written statements and answered no comment to all oral questions. So I'd like to ask the Commissioner if she thinks that responses like this risk undermining public confidence in investigations.
So firstly, I absolutely support the IOPC. We need something like them. I look forward to working well with them in the future. I have also regular meetings with the Director, and I feel that they are setting a very sort of productive tone in the main, and a very professional tone in the way they are trying to deal with the workload that they have. You mentioned, if I may, timeliness and justice, and unfortunately we do still have a system at the moment which is, for all parties, in my view, far too slow, particularly in the more serious cases that the IOPC are dealing with. We've managed to speed up quite a lot in the ones that our own professional standards units deal with, but these things do take too long for a whole variety of reasons, very complex. But I think if you're a complainant, or a bereaved person for that matter, it must be awful that it takes so long, and it's definitely horrible for my officers, who sometimes find themselves investigated and re-investigated over many, many, many years. This is just not a good way for us to operate. I have been, actually, I will be careful, but I have been slightly outspoken about some cases recently where, objectively, I feel that the IOPC perhaps could have taken a different course in some of their judgments, and I will continue behind the scenes to have, no doubt, robust conversations with them. But I want them to succeed. We look forward to new regulations next year, which I think will really transform, with a bit of luck, the way in which we deal with allegations, so that we are more in terms of learning and less in terms of pointing a finger and hanging people out to dry when they've been part of a system or something hasn't got wrong. In relation to the matter you raise about officers not answering questions, they are, of course, within their rights. They are citizens as well as police officers. I, of course, would always want to be in a system where there was sufficient trust on all sides that a professional police officer felt, under normal circumstances, that they would, of course, answer all questions when first asked. But you'll be very familiar with some of the complexities of the process and some of the risks that they may put themselves at if, for example, and I'm not saying this happened in this case, they have had insufficient disclosure, they haven't actually been given the assistance they should have been given at the point of the interview.
Can I just say finally, because we've got quite little time, I do appreciate it can be difficult to square the fact that a police officer, like any citizen, has the right to answer no comment, but also squaring that with what the public see.
Sure.
And in this case, particularly what the LGBT community saw, where the confidence, I think, has been damaged by that. And I don't know if you can give an answer on this in sort of 10 seconds, but is there anything that can be done to change that culture and encourage officers to give answers?
We do encourage them very much, in general terms, to give answers. I'm very pleased that we seem to have reached a more pragmatic position with the IOPC in terms of the interviews of officers immediately after an incident where somebody has died following police contact, the professional co-working to investigate what has happened. It's often in the course of another crime that is being investigated by the police, as you would understand, not always, but often, has gone really well in recent months, and the officers are finding themselves in a position where they feel that the IOPC are dealing with them very professionally, and they are absolutely complying with the regulations. They're making full statements at an early stage and just explaining exactly what has happened. And that's obviously good for everybody if we can, generally speaking, be in that position. I'd be very happy to talk to you outside about, as appropriate, the specifics of this case, but all I would say is that I wouldn't want people to think that if officers aren't answering questions, that's because they're being awkward or being evasive. There's often all sorts of reasons behind this, not all of which are, if you like, on their side of the table. They're on the other side of the table, have caused issues. We need to get to a place, I quite agree, where officers feel, in general terms, absolutely at ease to say what they have done, most of which is always captured on the bodyboard video and their impression of that. In some types of cases, it won't always be on body-worn, obviously, but I would, of course, want to work in a system where officers did answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner. Time is up. The Assembly welcomes pupils from the Gwyn Jones Primary School in Leytonstone. Right. Assembly Member Devonish.
Good morning, Commissioner. Morning. I'm sure you'll agree with me that meeting future challenges for policing in London includes close working with our wonderful London boroughs. So I was rather concerned to see that the scheme that was called often 2 for the price of 1 bobbies, or formerly known as the Met Patrol Plus scheme, may be scrapped. Please reassure me, Commissioner.
So we have more than one scheme at the moment. The schemes which are fully funded, where somebody gets a policing service in appropriate circumstances and they fully fund it, are working well and are important, and I fully support. The so-called buy one get one free scheme, I think, was a very useful scheme of its time. Of a time when we were in growth, when it kind of made sense. I have to say I cannot give you total reassurance about this. I am about to, in the next couple of weeks, meet the Deputy Mayor on the subject again. My own view is that this is, in many respects, skewing the activities of the Metropolitan Police in a way when we are short of resources and struggling to fill some of our core roles is proving very problematic. So I'm not going to give you a total reassurance. I know some local authorities have loved this scheme, being able to have, pay for one policing service and get another one free sounds like a good deal. And of course it's a good deal for their priorities, for their public in that bit of that borough. But it may not actually accord with the priorities that the Metropolitan Police Service, and indeed those who hold us to account, have.
Mr Mayor, you'll know that boroughs of all political persuasions, from Newham and Hammersmith and Fulham to Kensington and Chelsea, love this scheme. Will you please talk privately to the Commissioner and come back and pledge that your support for this vital scheme for local authorities across the political spectrum in London?
Look, I mean, I'm not sure if I can add much to what the Commissioner has said. I mean, in 2010, for example, for every 1,000 Londoners, there were 4 police officers. Now, for every 1,000 Londoners, there are 3 police officers. Now, that has an impact on the advice the Commissioner gives me and the Deputy Mayor in relation to how she moves around her resources. And by the way, not only have we lost more than 3,000 police officers, the Commissioner's also lost more than 3,000 community support officers. So look, the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime has conversations all the time with the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner, as indeed do I. But privately and publicly, I will not resile from the fact that my job is to support our Commissioner when she gives me advice about how to keep our city safe. And, you know, as the Commissioner said, we're reviewing all the assets the Commissioner has at her disposal. We've supplemented the assets she has by £138 million in relation to council tax precept increases and business rates increases. We are setting the budget for next year, and these will be part and parcel of those conversations that we have.
Will you at least give me an assurance, Mr Mayor, that when you make your decision, the people in this London Assembly will know before it's leaked out and we have to find it in page 74, Appendix C of a document?
Chair, look, leaks by their definition are never intentional, except for the Cabinet and Cabinet discussions. As far as we're concerned in this administration, when leaks happen, they're unfortunate. I don't like leaks happening. We try to have maximum transparency with the Assembly. You'll be aware, Chair, of the numerous occasions when the Deputy Mayor and very senior officers come to the Police and Crime Committee. Today, the Commissioner and I come here with pleasure to the plenary. We'll continue to be as transparent as we possibly can, and that includes once a decision's been reached between the Commissioner, Deputy Mayor, myself in this issue, of course we'll let key stakeholders know as soon as possible.
I'll try one last time then. Mr Mayor, would you at least tip off Assembly Member O'Connell so this doesn't shock some of the London boroughs when they find out? It'd be nice to actually have a clear communication channel, and hopefully it's good news and you will actually retain this scheme.
Well, we are talking hypotheticals, but of course as the Chair of the Police and Crime Committee, Steve's always tipped off before others.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We were questioning Claire Waxman, the Victims Commissioner, yesterday at the Police and Crime Committee. When I asked her how many boroughs she'd visited, and she's been in post, I believe, for about 18 months now, I think we were all surprised to hear that she's only been to 4 or 5. She couldn't remember, but she thought it was 4 or 5. Do you think it would be helpful if she was to make herself better known throughout London?
Well, you'll be aware that often we talk as politicians in wards, constituencies, boroughs, but when you meet victims groups, members of those groups come from all parts of our city, and Claire spends a lot of time meeting victims groups. It's worth reminding ourselves that before I became Mayor, before Claire was appointed, London didn't have a Victims Commissioner, so I'm surprised you didn't preface your question by congratulating me and Claire on her being the first Victims Commissioner and me appointing her. It's important that she meets as many Londoners as she possibly can from all parts of our city. She'll continue to do so. I make this one point, though, in relation to some of the people she meets. They've often moved from Borough A to Borough B and often to Borough C because of they're in havens, they could be in refugees, they could be in temporary accommodation. So necessarily going to a borough around London won't get you to meet as many victims as she wants to do, and she's met thousands of victims over the course of her being appointed Victims Commissioner, and she'll continue to meet victims across our city.
Yes, I accept that, and apparently they all have to come to her here. My point to you is, and I say it in a friendly way, Mr Mayor, do you not think that it would be nice if she was to make herself well known? We actually saw somebody before we saw her. It was a frontline worker for the Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Centre, and she said how they would appreciate knowing who she was, what she did, etc. Now I accept unreservedly she can't go to everywhere, but given that she's been in position 18 months, it would be nice sometimes, especially as she's talking to victims, if she actually went to them as opposed to them having to come up here, because I expect a lot of them are very traumatised and would appreciate a visit, as would the workers in various places. That's my only point, Mr Mayor.
Well,
Do you not think it would be helpful?
Well, I can repeat the answer she gave if you want me to. Yesterday, she continues to meet victims. She'll carry on meeting victims. I remember meeting a victims group with her in North London, not in City Hall, although I've met victims in City Hall as well. She'll continue to meet victims. In fact, the comment made to me is, on a number of occasions, is she's far better known than the National Victims Commissioner. I don't know if you know that we have got one apparently.
Yes, that's right.
And
I was just asking Mr. Mayor.
And she'll continue to make progress in the work she's done in her initial start as the Victims Commissioner.
Okay.
Assembly Member Boff.
Commissioner, do you accept that there are crimes which could have been stopped if we had in place a domestic abusers register?
I don't know. I really don't know. Quite possibly. Equally, if we have a domestic abusers register and it is unwieldy and difficult to operate, that there may be other crimes which don't get investigated properly.
In terms of its unwieldiness, ACPO back in 2008 had a value for money study on the operation of a domestic abusers register and found that it would pay for itself in 3 years if only 357 cases were prevented as a result, and that's easily within the number of national domestic abuse cases. It seem to me, and perhaps it seems to yourself, that this is a worthy commitment of time to ensure that we get a domestic abusers register that is fit for purpose.
So he's gone. I think I'm back to the conversation that I had with Len Duval. It depends how and what the expectations are that go with it, as to whether it would end up being a useful use of resource.
That review was back in 2008. Would you support another review by the National Police Chiefs Council?
I think, Andrew, I'll check, but I think they have been looking at this. I think they have.
So you would be supportive of that, even if it's ongoing? You're supportive of it ongoing, and if it's not ongoing, would you be supportive of a value for money study to ensure that that happens?
No, I think what I'm saying is I think they've looked at it recently, but I need to double check. I'll write to you. I think they've looked at it recently. I think they have concluded that this is not the right way to go, but I will double check for you.
Okay. Do you have confidence in the training that your officers have?
And we're talking here in relation to domestic abuse?
No, we've moved on to something else.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. In general?
In general, yes.
I think police training is generally of a very good standard. We have good frameworks, we have good guidance from the College of Policing. As you may know, I have set out for the Met to become genuinely more of a learning organisation, and we are about to embark on a big programme of improving and changing the way we deliver our training. We are about, as you also probably know, to bring in, as a result of a national change, a different form of entry for our new staff with the PEQF and obviously the degree entry or apprenticeship entry schemes. So there's a lot going on in police training. But if I was to take, for example, training of firearms officers or training in public order or training, I think it stands very good sort of...
Well, to help you out here, there was a reply, I believe, by the Mayor a little while ago, not this meeting, a previous reply, that there was sufficient training for those officers who were going to use spit guards, that there is sufficient training for those officers. Is that correct?
The officers are very highly trained in officer safety techniques. This has been transformed in the last 30 years, and I think the training that I was given, they are incredibly professional. They have a huge amount of training very regularly, every 6 months.
That's great, Commissioner.
But it doesn't include spit guards at the moment.
It doesn't yet. We have a reply from the Mayor saying that for the pilot scheme, the training was sufficient.
So in the custody, it's fine. Right. But if we were to roll out spit guards or some other method of
protecting the officers from spitting, we would have to give extra training to a much larger number of officers.
So you don't have confidence in your officers to be able to use spit guards in the most appropriate way out on the streets?
No, I didn't say that. What I'm saying is there would have to be more training. If we were to issue spit guards in the future, there would be more training. I have great confidence in my officers' abilities.
Well, obviously you don't have confidence at the moment because you're not allowing them to use the spit guards.
That isn't because I don't have confidence in their abilities.
Well, what do you not have confidence in then?
I am not satisfied that it is going to actually protect them from spitting in any large number of instances, and I'm not satisfied that overall it will result in them being safer, not less safe. That's not saying I don't trust them to make good decisions or I have I think we've got the best officers in the world, and you know that, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much. We now go on to the next table question, which relates to tackling violence against women and girls. And this will now be taken by Assembly-Member Curtin.
It's simply unacceptable that any woman or girl in our city should be the victim of these devastating crimes. London is one of the safest cities in the world for women, yet on average, 11 women and girls are raped or sexually assaulted every week. This is shocking. I want every woman and girl to not only be safe, but to feel safe in our great city. The increase in reported rapes in London forms part of a similar picture across the UK, with considerable discussion and debate on the possible underlying causes for the rise. These discussions are not yet fully resolved, and the National Police Chiefs Council Rape Working Group has requested analytical support from the National Crime Agency to examine the issue. Whilst the report created by Mobac's Evidence and Insight team has made some headway to understanding the London picture, there is still further research and analysis to be carried out. The most reliable data source on the prevalence of rape is the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which indicates there has been no increase in the volume of rape offences taking place. This data corroborates anecdotal evidence from partner agencies and outreach workers who have not reported any perceived increase in rape offences. If the number of rape offences has not risen, then increased reporting could be the result of either a greater proportion of rape victims reporting offences to the Met or improvements in the Met Police's recording processes. This is something we must get a better understanding of, and that's why, as part of our police and crime plan, we've commissioned specific work to look beneath the reported crime stats on sexual violence and abuse so that we can better understand what's happening. The work's still underway and is due to be completed by the end of the year. The findings will then be shared publicly. But I want to be clear today, my main focus around this issue is, and always will be, working to prevent violence against women and girls and ensuring that all victims of rape, sexual assault and domestic abuse have access to a fair system that delivers both the justice and the support they need.
You said there the Crime Survey of England and Wales sees that there's no increase in rapes, but there has been a huge increase in reports of rapes to the Metropolitan Police. And that doesn't correlate with the overall picture with violent crime. We see violent crime has gone down from 2000 to 2014-15 and then up again. There's a big bounce in the last 4 years. But in the reports of rape to the Metropolitan Police, that's been rising for much, much longer than the increase in violent crime since 2014. That's been rising since 2008, so before your tenure. 2008, 2009, there were just over 2,000 reports of rape to the Metropolitan Police. That's now up to approximately 7,500 in the 12 months to January this year, 2018. So which of those things, the two things you've said there don't seem to tie up with each other. So which do you think is more likely, that the number of rapes is not increasing or it is increasing? I mean, in London?
I think, with respect, we asked your first question, which I tried to answer, which is, the short answer is, the further piece of work being undertaken is to try and understand the explanation better. One explanation, which would, I suspect, be better received, is the reason for the increase in reporting is because people have more confidence. It's easier to report. The police deal with it in a more sensitive way, so it's encouraging people to report it more. That could be an explanation. I simply can't say which of the explanations that have been offered are the right ones.
I was asking because
could be the way it's recorded is changed. I gave two possible explanations.
Yeah.
We'll know towards the end of this year what the research says. It may be unclear from the research, by the way.
I mean, I do appreciate that you've got to wait to the research that comes out so that we actually have a better understanding. But this was brought up, I think, in a previous meeting, and your deputy, I have here, Sophie Linden, agreed with Assembly Member Whittle that the rise could not only be explained by a greater willingness to report crimes. So that would indicate that there is, there's obviously an increase in reporting, but there's also an underlying increase in this kind of horrible crime as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there could be. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think it's too simplistic to say it's because of better confidence. That's why, that's why victims who were victims before are now reporting it. That could be an explanation. That would be, a more acceptable and palatable explanation than the alternative, which is, these sorts of crimes are going up. It could be, as I've said, the way the Met Police records this has led to the increase in the figures. Of course, one of the things we'll do is also what's happening around the country. Are other forces having the same experience?
Okay, thank you very much. Time is up. We now come to the last table question, which is on reducing London's road crime, and it's from Assembly Member Russell.
Is that to me? Or?
So our focus has been working obviously within the Vision Zero strategy to tackle the most dangerous road users, to problem solve at identified locations, and to step up further our high visibility operations and patrolling. A huge amount of this work, of course, is done with others under the National Roads Policing Strategy and locally, particularly with Transport for London, with whom we have really good, co-working, integrated working. We try to innovate, and we've got lots of good examples of that. We're working closely with community groups and other organisations. We constantly review the data and profile what is happening, particularly in the most serious collisions. We use that data to target and deal with repeat offenders and those that cause the most danger, and we have an intelligence-led approach to that. We problem solve repeat locations and we identify hotspots where we should be. We carry out still, you'll remember many of you from a long time ago, the Operation Cubos, where we're out on the roads ending up with vehicles often being seized in large numbers. We are integrating some of our road safety operations with our violent crime operations, because a number of people who are violent crime offenders, of course, use vehicles and drive them dangerously and or without insurance. Our road transport officers have contributed hugely to the reduction in moped-enabled crime, which, of course, has been horrendously dangerous in some instances, with people driving in a completely anarchic way, and it's the road transport officers who are often the ones who are actually intervening and stopping the dangerous driving. And you will be aware that this year, sadly, we have had, I think, so far year to date, 82 fatalities in London on our roads, which compares to last year where we had 105.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, people walking and cycling on our roads account for more than a third of the casualties. So that's where I want to focus our conversation. It was really good to see that both the Police and Crime Plan and the Vision Zero Action Plan were talking about making London streets safer for people to walk and cycle. Now, a good way of reducing road danger is to cut speed, literally reducing the kinetic energy involved in any crash. So I fully support the Mayor bringing in 20-mile-an-hour speed limits on 37 streets and town centres on the Transport for London road network by 2024. Now, I'm from Islington. We've got main roads which have 20 mph speed limits, but no actual enforcement. So I'm curious, Commissioner, are you going to be committing more police officers to these new 20 mph areas to enforce these limits, or will these be enforced with cameras?
Caroline, I just don't know, actually, and that's genuine. That's just an ignorant answer. I don't know what we're going to do. I bet you somebody does in the Met, but I don't, and I'll have to come back to you. Suffice to say, you know that we have moved temporarily some people from our road... I'm sure you were going to ask a question about that, road transport policing, into our violent crime task force. They are therefore less able to do some of the enforcement activity that they were previously doing. However, there is a nice synergy in many respects in the work, in that violence on the buses and other forms of violence and some very dangerous road users are being targeted and brought to justice. But precisely how the enforcement is planned in the 20 miles an hour zones, I'm afraid I'm going to have to write to you.
That would be great. I'd be very interested to hear what the answer is eventually. Londoners often complain to me about people driving too fast on the roads where they live. One constituent who actually lives on a main road in Limehouse was apparently told by Transport for London to report every single instance of speeding to the police, or at least this is how the constituent told me, which seemed to be a rather laborious process. And I just wonder, sort of, Commissioner in particular, what do you think the solution is for situations like this? What should citizens who are experiencing this very dangerous behaviour on our roads, what should they be doing?
So, I agree that does sound slightly laborious, and anyway, of course, the person standing usually can't tell precisely what speed somebody has gone at. But absolutely, we would encourage local communities and local groups to identify the places that they think are the ones where speeding is most prevalent. It is something that our police community support officers in the Transport Command are out and looking for and looking out for. We do regularly, I did it myself just the other day, stop motorists and speak to them about the manner in which they're driving, even when we cannot prove that it's actually been excessive speed according to the law. This isn't something we ignore, and we do want the public to tell us where they are most concerned about. We can usually then do some work to discover whether that is a hotspot for excess speed, and we do enforcement in those places.
Well, that's very reassuring, because I think a lot of people feel, because obviously you've got terrible cuts and huge pressures on the police in all areas of policing, and I think people feel that the police don't really care that much about road traffic crime, and particularly when they raise it with their safer neighbourhood meetings, right down at ward level. Sure. It's very often not even an option for it to be included in the ward priorities. So is that, I'm just interested, how do you feel, right down to that ward level of policing, how do you feel about them taking up traffic policing, traffic issues?
Well, a lot of the reductions in speed that we have achieved have been through other measures than enforcement, as you know, right across the country, but not least in London, through changing driver behaviour, through informing drivers better, through having clear signage, and indeed through the public talking to other members of the public about their family and friends about it. And I think we do need to continue with technology and those other methods. But I was at a ward panel not so long ago where this was an issue, and the neighbourhood officers there were able to say what they had done and what they would do. But it is, of course, together with colleagues, it is always a matter of priority, as you say, and there will be many places in which this is not those officers' highest priority.
Yep. I'm afraid. Well, anything you can do to help get the seriousness, the impact on families of people being killed or very seriously injured on our roads is huge. Just finally, I just wanted to congratulate you on picking up on the successful West Midlands Close Pass policing scheme, where you have plainclothes officers on bikes who then experience people driving too close to them, and they are then picked up. I gathered, apart from picking up these vehicles that are dangerously close passing the cyclists, you're also catching a lot of people with lack of insurance, bald tyres, talking on the phone at the wheel, all sorts of other things that are dangerous and risky. Just Are you planning any kind of increase on the close pass policing that's going on at the moment?
I'm not. It's possible they are. I'll let you know.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That's it from me.
Assembly Member Berry.
Very quickly, if I can. I've received data from the Mayor and Mayor's question. For the first time, getting the number of prosecutions for hit-and-run road crime offences. And I've got a year's data there now to look at. I've compared it with the hit-and-run injury incidents for a year. And effectively, this is less than a third of these incidents coming to reach prosecution. So I wanted to ask, why is this rate of prosecution so low? These are hit-and-runs where people are injured. They're effectively violent crimes. Why is that prosecution rate so low?
Well, I mentioned earlier that our rates of bringing people to justice, which overall I think we should improve, and in other areas of violent crime, sadly, it's not as high as I would like. We do concentrate, of course, on the most serious ones, and I think we have, you find in the very serious collisions and God forbid, where there's been a fatality and somebody has made off, we have a higher detection rate and a higher bringing people to justice rate. We do pursue all those cases. They are investigated where there is a line of inquiry. We don't ignore it, but we then obviously have to not just identify who the offender might be, but pin down who it actually was and find them and be able to prove the case. And there's quite a lot of steps in that, Sian, but I do believe, I agree with you, we should be achieving a higher rate than we currently are.
Okay,
right.
Out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for Commissioner.
Thank you.
It's been hopefully a pleasure for you as it was for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I now go on to the motion set out in my name, which is that the Assembly notes the answers to the questions asked. Thank you very much. We now come to petitions. First petition is from Assembly Member Devenish. Are you not going to read out the prayer?
Sorry, I haven't done this before, as you can tell. A petition from the residents of 29 Essex Street, WC2, concerning the underground noise and vibration at Temple Station. I'd like to present this to TfL to get a response, please.
Okay. Will the Assembly agree to forward this petition? Thank you very much. Assembly Member Russell has a petition.
I do, yes. It is a petition from Aziz Minot with 86 signatures, and it says, we, the undersigned, call on the Mayor and Transport for London to direct the 287, 372 and 165 buses that travel through Rainham Village, Essex, to stop at the Rainham Interchange bus stop outside Rainham Station.
Thank you very much. Would you agree to forward this petition? Thank you. Right. Item 5. Will you please note the responses which we have received to petitions presented at recent Assembly plenary meetings? Right. Thank you very much. We now come to motions. And the first motion is in the name of Assembly Member Duval, but in fact is going to be in the name of Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. I move this motion, which is to, as we commemorate the 100 years of ending of the World War I, this is part of the British Royal Region's thank you campaign, and to recognise the sacrifice of all the servicemen and servicewomen, those people of faith and no faith who fought for the freedoms and for the values which we hold so dearly now. It pays tribute and recognition to the 1.1 million United Kingdom citizens and, United Kingdom soldiers and servicemen, and also those from the Commonwealth who paid the ultimate sacrifice of their lives for the values which we hold true. And of course, we can reflect on the huge amount of sacrifice that they did, and also to say that it's appropriate that we do record the thanks from the Assembly in recognition of the campaign which the British region has been running on behalf of all of us. And so I move this motion, which I had to move it because Len Debra had to go in on a family emergency, so I'm moving it on his behalf, but I'm delighted to do so on behalf of the Labour Group.
Okay. Assembly Member Bacon to second.
Well, this is one of those motions where it's
very easy to support every single word of the motion as it's drafted without any reservation at all. Do you know, for people of our generation, the scale of the sacrifice made by previous generations is almost inconceivable. People alive in this country in this day and age simply could not conceive, I don't think, of a conflict that could consume 50,000 people on the first day of a battle that took weeks. When we contrast it with the conflict that we've been in most recently in the Middle East for more than a decade and a half, and a couple of thousand of people have tragically lost their lives, the idea that 50,000 people could die in one day on the opening day of a battle is something beyond compare in our experience. And the selfless dedication to duty by so many people and the hellish conditions that they endured on behalf of their country is simply awesome to contemplate. And I think in this year where we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of the Great War, it's entirely appropriate that we pay tribute to the efforts and the sacrifices of generations past. The Royal British Legion does fantastic work. Len Duval is the spearhead of that work here in City Hall. It's a shame that he had to leave, and I think the motion was ably moved in his absence by Assembly Member Sahota. And their thank you movement deserves, I believe, the unswerving support of everybody in this room. So it gives me pleasure to second the motion, but I hope it will go through without any dissent at all. Thank you.
Assembly Member Dismore.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, I endorse everything that's been said. Indeed, both my grandfathers served in the First World War. My maternal grandfather joined up on day one and was at the Somme in the Royal Field Artillery. But the point I wanted to make is something that always gets forgotten about, and that's the Chinese Labour Corps, who were not from the UK or the Commonwealth, but they made a huge contribution in conditions which can only be described as virtual slavery, paid very little, and incredibly strong people moving an enormous amount of material, and also, in the end, serving very close to the front line, and many died. And I just think that one of the things that we do forget about are the huge contribution, without whom we may well not have succeeded, of the Chinese Labour Corps, and particularly draw attention to the campaign to create a memorial to the Chinese Labour Corps in Chinatown. There is a campaign for this. It's having great difficulty getting traction and attracting the finances needed. And I think that's something that we all ought to support as well.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Arnold.
Yes, Chair, it's to follow on from my colleague and just to say I welcome in this motion reference to the contribution made from soldiers from the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth soldiers responded to the call, and sometimes we forget that the Germans and their allies went to war not just with Britain, but with the whole of the British Empire as it was, and that over 3 million soldiers and labourers from across the Empire as it was and the Commonwealth served alongside the British Army in the First World War. So I'm certainly looking to see how myself and others who support the view that I have, that those contributions should not be forgotten, and I welcome the British Legion's recognition of that fact. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bailey.
I endorse everything that's in this motion, just to say the tireless work of the Royal British Legion to remind us of the world wars that this country has been through is incredible and is very poignant, particularly to me as I have a family link. My grandfather fought in the Second World War, and I currently have a strong link with the military because of my cadet activity. And that's activity I want to focus on. These activities are very important to young people to help them understand the level of sacrifice that's been made to create their society, and also their duty going forward to try and avoid this being necessary again. And just to follow up on Andrew Dismore's comments, the campaign that the Chinese community have been running to get recognition for the Chinese Labour Corps is incredible and should be supported. It's very important to them because they made a huge contribution. And as Andrew pointed out, they were from outside of the Commonwealth, from outside of Europe. So their sacrifice was, again, extraordinary because of that. So I welcome all the comments made and support this motion unreservedly.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Curtin.
Chair, I'll just quickly add my voice to support everyone who's spoken already and to support this motion. And of course, 100 years on, We remember everybody who sacrificed their lives and who rose to the call to give up more than hopefully any of us will be asked to give up, and we remember them, and that we are now a free nation because of their sacrifice. So I join with all of you to say thank you to all of those people, and thank you to the Royal British Legion as well, who keeps the memory of our forefathers alive.
Thank you. Any more? Those in favour, please show.
It's unanimous.
Unanimous. Thank you very much. We now move to the motion in the name of Assembly Member Dismore.
Diwali is celebrated by many thousands of Londoners in our Hindu, Sikh and Jain communities, marking the victory of light over darkness, good over evil. Celebrating Diwali is one of those things that makes London special. The vibrancy, energy, colour and food of the Diwali celebration are always unforgettable. The Mayor is rightly keen to promote the city as open, and nothing says that better than Diwali. London's strength is built upon its historic diversity and multiculturalism, with Diwali celebrations providing a major boost to community relations and integration each year. In these divisive political times, it's extremely important that we celebrate the message of the festival. It's therefore absolutely right that schools in London teach about Diwali. Every child in London should know that they live in a proudly multicultural society, and why their school friends and neighbours are celebrating different festivals like Diwali. However, this may not be the view of all Assembly members. Indeed, one has even written in a pamphlet I have here, you bring your children to school and they learn far more about Diwali than Christmas. What it does is rob Britain of its community. Without our community, we slip into a crime-riddled cesspool. The AM concerned may have attempted to apologise for his writings, suggesting if I've caused offence to anyone any offence, please don't take offence, which is hardly an apology and a repudiation of his statements, and to suggest they were taken willfully out of context is clearly wrong.
Assembly Member Dismore, are you quoting a member of this Assembly?
I am.
Well, I don't think that you should do so.
I don't see why it's out of order, Chair.
I'm advised that it is.
On what basis?
The Chairman's ruling, advice from officers.
Well, I'm sorry, Chair, but I see nothing wrong with what I'm saying. I've got the
an election, you know.
I've got the pamphlet here.
Yeah,
I've got the pamphlet here. I'm not quoting it out of context, and there's those who criticise the words in here taken out of context.
The
The
objection is that you are quoting a member of the Assembly, and you're simply.
I'm not standing for anything. I'm not standing for Mayor. And of course, these statements.
I have been given formal words to use.
And I would simply say, Chair,
what a member of the Assembly has said in the past when not undertaking GLA business is not relevant here today.
Well, I would. Question that.
Listen, look,
I could question that, Chair, because
I am advised. I'm advised by officers that this is out of order. We employ officers to tell us these things,
well,
and I very much hope that you will accept that advice.
Well, I'm sorry, Chair.
So
do you not have other meetings to go to? Regular meetings, but not till 2 o'clock.
Do not belittle this. You know, I did say at the last meeting of the Assembly, I didn't want the Assembly to be using this as a kind of adjunct for the election activities of any particular party or any particular candidate. Well, and I think that this is something that you're doing.
Well, I'm not standing for Mayor.
So I'm ruling this part of your speech out of order, and that's that.
Well, Chair, I actually have here the document.
I'm ruling it out of order. Do proceed to something else.
Well, I will.
In relation to your motion.
Right, I will, but I am rather surprised and disappointed to read these views, which I'm sure are not shared by very many in this chamber today. And I believe, and I hope that the majority here also believe, that we should fully support the fact that Diwali and indeed other communities' festivals are taught in our schools across the capital, with or without censorship from the Chair for political reasons.
No, I don't accept that, and I must ask you to withdraw that. My job is to be entirely objective. I work on the advice of officers who are equally objective. So I would ask you please to withdraw that suggestion that I am not being objective.
make a point of order?
Of course.
Thank you. Well, it was just to seek some clarification on that basis. Are we to now believe that what any Assembly member has said in the past can never be quoted in any Assembly meeting? Is that your ruling? Yeah. And does that apply to the Mayor as well?
I'm seeking advice.
The advice provided to the chairman would usually be that GLA resources must be used for GLA business, and therefore that comments made previously by a mayor or assembly member in a previous capacity would not usually relate to the business at hand.
Well, on a point of order, my comments were directly related to my motion.
Can I
on teaching
let me please suggest a way out of this. Can this go to the next Bureau of Leaders so that we can thrash it out and we have it chapter and verse to actually deal with this on the hoof in this way? I don't think is the way to deal with it.
I'm fine with that.
Well, let's first.
It would be most unreasonable. And I would like to know what regulations, right, on which this is being based upon, right? You cannot go around making arbitrary decisions. What we do require is the regulation on which the decision is made, right? It seems quite absurd that we can't quote a comment made by an Assembly member previously, and if it does apply to Assembly members, then it applies equally to the Mayor. So I think we would like you, Chair, to give us the ruling, right, on which we can rely upon repeatedly and not arbitrarily.
Well, Assembly members, I have said that the appropriate way now to deal with this is we go to the Bureau of Leaders so that we know how to deal with this chapter and verse. You know, you're quite right. To deal with this on the hoof is not something which I would wish, but I am acting on the advice which I have received. Assembly Member Bacon.
Chairman, I understand the argument has now broken out. I think it's rather a pity that it has, because the motion of the wording as written is something I think that everybody in the room will support. I think your suggestion of taking this to Bureau and deciding it there is better than the undignified squabbling that we're doing at the moment. So let's move on, get the motion seconded, and then we can debate the motion.
Yes. Assembly Member Bailey.
Do I have the right to say something in what's been said about me?
Well, no.
I didn't know you. You might as well have done.
Point of clarification about when we look at this.
So we're not going to move
outside of the meeting.
Can
we get clarification on whether it is required that an Assembly member raises a point of order in terms of things being in order or not? Because I don't believe any Assembly member actually raised an objection to Andrew Dismore's speech just now, and I'm not sure that was quite within the
I think that Tony Arbor is an Assembly member. He's also the chair.
And also clarification on which of our standing orders it is that's being invoked in this case when this gets looked at.
I think it's entirely appropriate that I should do this on the advice of officers, and that's how the thing works. Okay, can I put this motion, please? There is a I'm sorry.
Chair, I formally second and reserve my right to speak.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anybody else want to speak on the matter? Assembly Member Curtin.
Thank you, Chair. So this motion has 2 paragraphs, and I would absolutely agree with the first paragraph, which is about our Hindu, Sikh and Jain friends who live in London, and many of those who came over in the Windrush generation, who love this country, who contribute to this country, who work hard and integrate very, very well into our nation and our city. And I think we all welcome the contribution of these communities. But the second paragraph then goes on to say that diversity and multiculturalism is a strength.
Of course.
It's not always the case. And we are now heading to a position in London where we are not just a diverse city, but a hyper-diverse city, where the indigenous culture and the indigenous people are in a minority and are on the way to becoming a very small minority, and we've seen that in the census.
Yes.
Chair, I would appreciate if I could have no interruptions in my speech.
If you want to rebut him in a speech.
So, as I was saying, 60% of people in this country, in response to a poll earlier this year, said that multiculturalism was a bad thing. The previous leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, said the experiment of multiculturalism has failed. And diversity is often taken to mean a diversity of appearance, but without any diversity of thought. So there's lots of people who look different and have different genders, but all have the same stale, humorless, politically correct opinions.
That's the Labour Party.
Exactly, and this is a motion from the Red Team, and I disagree with this motion for that reason. What I'm not going to do, however, I'm not going to vote against the motion. I will abstain because, on behalf of UKIP, I would agree, obviously, with the first paragraph, those migrants, and if we have low immigration into the country of people who integrate well, that's a good thing. But if we have so much immigration, so much multiculturalism, so much humorless diversity of appearance, but a homogeneity of thought, that is not good for the city and it's not good for the nation. So because that's in the second paragraph, I cannot agree with the whole motion. So I will abstain on this motion, and that is my position. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Anybody else want to speak on this? Do you want to do more?
Yes, Chair. And strongly support and commend this motion. As a proud British Indian, a Jain, I made Brent and Harrow my home in the last 44 years. So have some 65,000 Hindus in Brent and some 68,000 Hindus in Harrow. And it is those nearly 140 Hindus, which include Jains and Sikhs, who are part of my constituency of rich multicultural tapestry, contributing to the community cohesion and success of London as the world's leading metropolis of diverse cultures and the successes that result from that. I'm immensely proud that Harrow has the highest concentration of Hindus in the UK, very closely followed by Brent. As Hindus, we follow the values and teachings of one world, universality. We follow and promote peace and non-violence, practiced through lively and colorful festivals like Diwali, the subject of this motion. Diwali teachings and Hindu New Year have a very, very special relevance to London and Londoners. The epic of Ramayana, the story of Lord Rama and Sita, and its message of victory of the good over the evil, symbolized by Deepavali, commonly known as Diwali, heralds the victory of light against darkness, capturing spiritual values of Hinduism which have helped shape multicultural London. It is rewarding to see that the success of multicultural London is a far cry from the prediction of the rivers of blood when Asians from East Africa came to the UK, of whom the majority were and are Hindus. I'm also pleased that Hindus and their teachings have not resulted in crime-ridden Brent, the area I'm proud of, which I represent. And Hindu teachings have not resulted in any of such bad aspects. I will be attending Diwali celebrations at a local primary school where I have been a governor for the last 25 years and know from their experience, from our experience of what happens at school, that such teachings of Diwali, Christmas, Hanukkah, and all other spiritual experiences have brought together benefits to the parents, pupils, teachers, and our local communities. 7th of November, next week, is the day of Diwali. On the 8th of November, we will be celebrating Annakut, the Hindu New Year, on next Friday. It is very interesting to note that we have great representation of the Hindu communities in this very chamber. We have Onkar Sahota, who represents the Sikh community as a Sikh himself. we got Assembly Member Desai as a Hindu, and I'm a Jain. So these are the main strands of Hinduism, the Hindu religion. So on that note, I convey my best wishes to the Hindu, Jain and Sikh communities on the auspicious occasion of Diwali and Hindu New Year. May the New Year bring happiness, good health, prosperity and peace to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to speak on this matter? Those in favour? You do? Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Bearing in mind what I've
Well,
said.
I shall very much bear in mind what you've had to say. My main concern is to respond to Assemblymember Curtin, who claims that multiculturalism hasn't worked, and he complains about the indigenous people being a minority. Now, I'd like to know who the indigenous people are in his concern, because looking at a pamphlet I'm not allowed to quote from, there's a couple of paragraphs which I actually agree with about North Kensington and the people who've born there and grown up there from a very diverse background. And if I were allowed to quote it, I'd say racial tension is not a feature of life here. I said if I was allowed to, but I didn't, Chair. Now, Chair, I used to represent for 15 years the neighbouring ward to this in Westminster. And I know the area very well, probably just as well as the author of this pamphlet I'm not allowed to talk about. And I'd simply say, Chair, if Mr Curtin means by indigenous white people, then I would strongly and utterly reject what he has to say. If he means indigenous people being in a minority, all our diverse community in London, I still don't understand what he's getting at. Frankly, I reject completely what he has to say, and I hope that members, irrespective of our early little spat, will vote for the wording of the motion before us this afternoon.
Right, thank you very much. Those in favour of the motion, please show. Those against?
Majority.
Okay, Name Con. Right, we now move nearly finally to the action taken under my delegated authority.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Will you please note the dates of future members of the Assembly?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Will you note the date of the next scheduled meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. I have no urgent business.
Marvellous.
GLA Chamber
mention a new violence reduction